Iceland is of particular interest to me because I actually just developed a card game set in Viking Age.
Mr. Capillo, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Thank you.
Good.
Can you hear me?
Yes, of course.
Huh.
I can hear you, I can see you. No, I cannot see you. Where are you from, my friend? I try to speak to you in Russian all the time. Yeah. Jake, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Good, good, good. Thanks for joining our interesting club here. I don't know if you have I set up the website first time. I just wanted to show everybody.
Oh yeah, awesome.
Yeah, we're here. Generally we do history discussions. Today, King John. Magna Carta.
Yes.
Famous King John and brother of Richard the Lionheart. So we'll have our own Jonathan. He did a Teutonic Knights previously. So he's going to repeat that today on King John. So, but on a weekly basis, like on Wednesdays, we discuss any particular historical, subject matter. But on Saturdays, we kind of follow the outline, and we have ancient Greek right now. We started with Mesopotamia, Levant, Mesopotamia, the first cities of the world, then you have, the Sumerian Empire, then Akkadian Empire, and then we moved into the Greek world. And then we're going to obviously move into the Roman world after we finish with Alexander the Great, his Diadoches and all that stuff. Then we have a second portion on Sundays. We actually do kind of like modern history and all other stuff, like stuff like Zionism in Israel on Sunday, which was interesting. It's the second part of it. Next week we'll do nuclear race war between USSR and Soviet Union. So we go from Alexander the Great and the fall of Sparta to this, and then today we actually have King John. So and then also on Thursdays we do different subject matters. Like tomorrow we have future of the electronic vehicles. So it'd be like a future of something, or let's say we talk about history of foreign exchange, or previously we talked about history of Bitcoin and the ledger system. So it's kind of like general knowledge too as well. So
nice.
Yeah.
Awesome. So this is Zakar. So that's you.
That's my name. Yeah, that's my name. And
nice.
I set up this website and just virtually today. And I have a YouTube channel, and all the everything we do, we record.
Yeah.
They end up in YouTube channel right here, and then you can just click on this website. And I think I send it through chat. It's called omnicarta.org. Magna Carta was taken, so I call it Omnicarta.
Nice. Very cool.
Yeah, and then if you go about, you can see our schedule. Like you have a channel, and then you have a schedule at the end. Our future events.
Very cool.
Yeah, like this is all our ancient part. We have Greece, and we're moving. Actually, it would be interesting to talk about Etruscans. Somewhere in April, we'll talk about Ethiopia, Aksum, Ethiopia. Then we're going to move into Rome, which start with Romulus, Roman kings, and stuff like that. Then the first king of pre-Romantic. And then we have our, like I said, we touch on Bushido, Kodo, Hanseatic League, interesting stuff, different presenters. And we also have ancient texts. Like next week, I'm doing Joseph Flavius, Jewish Wars. And about a month from there, we'll do Xenophon, Anabasis. Interesting one. Both of them are amazing. Homer, obviously, people read Homer all the time.
Yeah.
Today's King John. And on the 30th would be an interesting one. We're going to do the personality of Idi Amin, who was called the Hitler of Africa. So.
Mm-hmm.
And then we do like history of beer, just to lighten up, the subject matter, future of electronic vehicle, history of ancient weaponry, history of mining and metallurgy, history of wine. So it'll be a lot of interesting stuff.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. Awesome.
Yeah, so we're getting people gonna go in about 5-10 minutes. So how do you like history? What do you like per se? Which period in history do you like?
Well, I actually am in a reenactment and with Andrew, who are your presenters tonight. Yeah, so they're good buddies of mine, and behind me here I have, let's see. I have, where's it at? Yeah, I'm into all this stuff too.
Oh wow.
King John, my medieval studies books and
So
everything. So
can I ask you a question? Would you be interested in the future presenting something as well? And you know, on top of, you'll see how it goes today, but we have a very friendly crowd, you know, 30 people today. So,
okay.
you know, and
Yeah, I would, I could probably be into that. I would have to work something up, but there's a couple subjects that might be of interest that I'm kind of interested in that might work out.
nice. Yeah, you know, I'm looking for good presenters. I mean, we have amazing presenters here. Like,
Yeah.
you know, if you go to our channel, I mean, it's just problem is it's just long videos of 3-4 hours. People are sometimes, you know, like, you know, get tired, but otherwise it's awesome.
Yeah. Give me 1 second.
No problem. Take your time. Mr. Fraja, how are you? Is it Jeff? Jerry.
No, it's Frank. Yeah, doing great. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No worries.
Yeah, I know. I was just telling people I set up a website for us.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so we can now, you know.
So are all the videos posted there?
That's right. So the website called omnicarta.org, and I put it on the chat.
Okay.
I just want to show it to everybody.
Is it on YouTube or is it how are the videos posted?
So if you go to if you go scroll down, you'll see different videos here. Just click on it. It's on YouTube. It takes you right into YouTube.
You might want to put on the chat again because when I joined, it's not on the chat now. Yeah.
Sounds good.
Hi, Zach.
How are you? Oh my
Why
God.
are you recording yet?
My favorite person. I mean, no pun intended. She's my favorite person. How are you?
Who?
You?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, are you recording? I don't want to be in recording.
Not right now. I'm not.
Okay. Hello. How are you?
How are you?
Fine. Zach, what is your YouTube channel?
Okay, so I made it easier. I set up a website. How
Oh,
about that?
because I keep.
I'm gonna post it on the chat now.
Okay.
Hopefully, I don't know. It keeps taking it. Yeah. All right, I'm gonna post it on the chat.
Okay.
All right, it's called omnicarta.org. Very easy. omnicarta.org.
Omni Carta. Okay.
And I'll go through, once people log in, I'll go through the website. You know, Jonathan isn't here, right? Jonathan, you're in?
Zach, if you post in your discussion on the meetup group permanently, it would be there.
Yes.
Okay.
So
that's the website that lead to YouTube?
yes. So you click right here. You see on the middle of the section, you'll see YouTube. You just click on it and it's taken to a discussion and tell you where it is and stuff like that.
Oh, okay. So you have the old presentations in them?
That's right.
So how many people been?
So before we get going, I want to introduce to you a friend of mine and someone who is a kind of a scholar in his own right. His name is Andrew. Andrew's going to be joining me tonight. We're going to kind of co-present some information on England under King John in his reign, 1199 to 1216. So we're really excited to be here and to share some of this information. And as I know is kind of the routine for this group, if you have questions, ask them. If it's something that we're going to cover a little bit later in the presentation as we go along, we'll let you know. Otherwise, we'll try to answer for you as we move. But we're excited to be here. We appreciate the invitation, the opportunity to come and share. And we will go ahead and get started. So I'm going to go here to our first slide. And I'm going to let Andrew go ahead and kick us off here with some fast facts about John and a little bit of his background before we get into his actual reign.
All right, so as you can see by the taglines up on the slide, John was born in 1160, died in 1216, is King of England from 1199 to 1216, and
sorry, Andrew. Sorry, Zach.
Yes.
We can hear you talk. Zach.
No, I'm not talking.
Test.
Yeah. I hear somebody voice beside Andrew.
We don't hear it.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
No, please let me know if I have a lot of hours in Google Meets right now, but I am not as deft in my Zooming. So please let me know if anything is unclear or mute comes on or any of those things. My camera keeps switching off too. So just, I'm not trying to hide anything from anyone. There was no reason in the 11th and 12th, or in the 12th and 13th century for anyone in England to think that John would become king. Mm-hmm. He was the youngest of the sons in his family. He had 3 older brothers, 2 of whom were actually kings of England, although his eldest brother, who was named Henry, the same as his father, was sort of a co-king for a period of time with his father, Henry II. This had been common in other parts of Europe. It was kind of a new thing for England, did not work out so well. It was the last time it was tried, so not a very successful experiment. And then, of course, John's older brother, Richard the Lionheart, famously King of England. He had a brother between him and Richard, Geoffrey of Anjou, who was also probably would have made a bid for king himself if he had not died. If he had not died in an unfortunate tournament accident. So there's lots of drama to John's family. His parents, Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, were the power couple of their day. And Eleanor of Aquitaine in her own right is just a fascinating person to study. I could talk for hours on just their connections, but in short, it's important to remember at this time that Henry II was not just King of England, but he was also Duke of Normandy. That had been the case for most of the time since William the Conqueror had conquered England in 1066. But Eleanor of Aquitaine, she had been married before marrying Henry II to Philip of France. The marriage did not go well, but when she and Philip ended their marriage, she took with her about a quarter of what we would consider the territory of modern France. And that came to Henry II with their marriage. So Henry II, almost, in terms of size, almost half of what we would consider France today is controlled by this family. Sometimes called today the Plantagenets, probably not a period term, often called the Angevin Empire, which seems to be a little closer to period language, but a huge amount of territory. So John came from an amazing power couple. It was, or an amazing, powerful family, but it was also a family full of intrigue. Every single one of John's brothers had been part of revolutions against their father, Henry II, at various points. None of them successful. Eleanor herself is going to spend a large portion of her life in prison because she tries to help her sons in one of these rebellions. It was kind of expected that sons would rebel against their fathers if they were kings. It was totally unexpected that a wife would rebel against her husband. But when Henry II dies and Eleanor is released, she lives, I forget off the top of my head when she dies, but it is quite far into John's reign. And
1204.
1204, thank you.
Yes.
And she acts very much as a tempering element to John. And we'll see as we talk about John, he was a man who did better when he had good tempering elements around him. But as the tagline there is, John is probably best known today as the worst king of England. And we're going to explore a little bit and see, was John really the worst king of England? Does he live up to the hype or not?
Perfect. So now we want to kind of jump in a little bit to how we might judge John. If people say that John is the worst king of England, how do we make a distinction like that? And thankfully for us, there's a lot of stuff. There's actually an explosion of period documents that start at the end of the 12th, beginning into the 13th century. John's reign is when, in England anyway, we start to record lots of stuff. So there is a ton of information out there about John from contemporary sources, which is really nice. So we want to look at contemporary sources. We also want to look at the historiography that we have. There's a great tradition of historiography about John. And then in recent years, that's become a little bit more muddled, but we're going to kind of jump into that right there. And Andrew, if you want to take over a little bit here, and then we'll move on. Absolutely.
So in, I guess you could say in the last century, although I'm thinking more of like the 70s and 80s by that. But there was a kind of a push among historians to try to revitalize John's reputation. And a lot of the arguments made that he just was terribly unlucky and that he was faced with some fairly powerful and incredibly clever adversaries in the Capetian family who ruled France at the time, particularly Philip and even his later son Louis, who are largely responsible for building modern France.
Yeah.
So it's well deserved. They were an exceptional family in their own right. But the most recent historians to write on John have basically said, well, this is maybe an interesting historical exercise, and redefining people and looking into their lives, it can be a very useful historic exercise. But on the whole, John probably deserves his bad reputation. Yeah. And both Jonathan and I very much, I think, agree with that point of view.
Yeah, we're in the same spot there, I think.
Yeah, we're gonna hit some of those points. So in terms of the historiography and the attempts to revitalize John, well, he made some very, very clever decisions in his life. But if anybody could mess up a good choice or a good decision or moving in the right direction, it was John himself.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. I love this quote here by Matthew Paris, who was a monk writing in St. Albans Monastery just north of London. He was one of the primary, if not the chief chronicler in all of the 13th century, particularly starting in the kind of the second quarter of the 13th century and moving ahead. Any of you who have come across the Morgan Bible or the Masiowski Bible will know his artwork. And he was a very respected chronicler at his time. He does have a little bit of a flair for the dramatic, but that kind of draws me to him a little bit, I think, personally, because we all love a good story. But Matthew Paris, writing a generation after John, about 15 to 20 years after his death, the earliest accounts of this would put it in the early 1230s. But definitely he had access to people who were alive during John's reign. He had all kinds of information about John. He himself was alive during John's reign, but not necessarily, at an age to perform what he would later go on to do. But this quote about John, I think, sums up everything, where he says, "Foul as it is, hell itself is made fouler by the presence of King John." What prose, what a way to try to put a point on someone that, that really gets the point across. And I think, to me, that sums up this next point, which is that in his own time, John was judged by almost all of his contemporaries to be lacking in both character and in ability. There are 4 major biographies of John that are concurrent with his own life or immediately right after his life. Out of the 4 of them, and we'll talk more about this in a little bit, one of them is neutral. One of them is neutral. One of them is negative. 2 of them are extremely negative. So many people don't have anything good to say about John. So how do we actually judge him? How do we determine whether he's as bad as his contemporaries believed him to be? And the way that we have to do that is by judging him by the rules of his own time. We look at the behaviors and the expectations of what was going on in that day. And to sum it up, generally speaking, there are 4 responsibilities that a king has in his job as king. He's to safeguard and uphold the law. He's to protect the church. He's to display honor, grandeur, and to use wealth prudently for these ends. And of course, he's supposed to be a warrior. And particularly in England, that last piece becomes really important for John, because he comes on the heels of 2 great military commanders. Henry II was no joke. Richard was the most famous warrior of his time. He and William Marshall were the most famous warriors of their time. And William Marshall is a contemporary of John's also. So to kind of be in that warrior ethos and that culture, you had to be a competent battlefield leader and a good warrior. So looking at this, we start with safeguarding and upholding the law. And this is an important thing. And it appears that John does take a keen interest in the law. His harshest critics will say that this is merely just a revenue stream for him. This is a way for him to find people, to accept bribes, because John is going down every avenue he can to get his hands on money. And it feels very grubby to anybody that's around him. So he does take an interest in the law, and seemingly he shows mercy and grace to people who cannot harm him, who have no ability to serve or help him. And two of the stories that I'll share about this, he presided over 2 cases personally, one of a woman whose husband defrauded her and spread awful rumors about her in the community, and she couldn't do anything about it. And John ruled in her favor because he felt compassion for her. And then there was a story of a young boy who was playing out around his home, and he was throwing stones, and he threw a stone and accidentally killed his own mother. And to some degree, John wasn't, without human nature, because he felt compassion for this child and said that he should not be put to death, because of the laws at the time. So he did take compassion on some people. But those stories are really hard to find. It took me a long time to find any good stuff about John in the law, because what you find more than anything is that nobody trusted John's word. Yeah. Nobody wanted to have anything to do with him in a legal process. And to kind of illustrate some of those points, I'll tell you the story of William de Mowbray, who was a powerful earl in his own right, and he needed John to rule in his favor in a court case. And he paid John that says 2,000 pounds. I should say 2,000. Well, maybe it is 2,000 pounds. It's either 2,000 pounds or 2,000 marks. A little bit of a difference there. Not a huge amount of difference, but anyway, at this time, that's a huge amount of money for a noble at the time. This could be around 2 years' salary, or maybe a little bit more, maybe less for some of the big boys. But your average guy around about 2 years' salary. So he pays this to John in order to get his favor in a court case. And John takes the money and then rules against him anyway. And he knows when William is giving him this money, John knows what the money is for. And then he basically throws him the middle finger and says, "I'll do what I want. I've already got your money." He married Isabella of Gloucester in order to gain lands, and then divorced her because he didn't like her. To some degree, they were related, fairly closely related. The Pope said that you can get married as long as the marriage bed remains unused. So because of the medieval idea of consanguinity, where family members that have today we would say DNA that's too closely linked, they don't need to produce offspring. These people weren't idiots. They knew what happened when inbreeding was the norm. So the Pope said you can't do that. After a while, John got tired of this and decided to sell the marriage rights He had divorced her, and this is, of course, completely against the church, but he had decided to divorce her and then was going to sell the rights for someone else to marry her.
And an annulment over consanguinity is just, so if you were a noble of this level in Western Europe at this time, there wasn't anybody that you weren't related to closely enough through consanguinity for the Pope to challenge the marriage. And so this was often used politically as a way of ending marriages. But nevertheless, it's the after effect here that really.
Exactly. It wasn't necessarily a big deal for him to seek an annulment. It wasn't normal that it was granted, but he went against the rule anyway. He took two nobles that he knew were interested in, because at this point, marriage is, for especially in the nobility, marriage is as much of a contract as it is anything else. Geoffrey de Say and Geoffrey de Mandeville, and he says, "I'll charge you 20,000 pounds for the rights to marry John's ex-wife." And he offers it to both of them at the same time and accepts some money. These guys probably didn't have that much cash up front, but he accepted down payments from both of them. And then it ended up that he got caught and he was in hot water and he hated it and they hated him and he pitched a fit and it just became this whole big deal. One of the other things that's really important about him is that he breaks the norms of treatment for nobility. Andrew mentioned a little while ago that Eleanor of Aquitaine was actually put into imprisonment by her husband, Henry II, when she rebelled against him. Now, imprisonment for someone like her is to have a castle and some grounds to herself. She still gets gifts. She's still very well taken care of in some ways. So it's not like what we would think of as modern day imprisonment. But there were rules about how you treated people, even when you needed to do something like that. And John completely ignored those rules at every turn. His own nephew, who was a rival to the throne, he had him imprisoned. And there's rumors circulating. A lot of the chroniclers at the time, 3 out of the 4 chroniclers, believe that he actually killed Arthur, his nephew. And not that he even paid somebody to do it, but that he did it by his own hand and dumped his body into the Seine so that it would never be discovered. There was a noblewoman, Maud de Brioze, and her husband, William de Brioze, was actually the noble who was keeping watch over Arthur for John. Arthur and John got into an argument with each other over something, and they believed, the chronicler believed, yes.
The kicking off point for this is that one of John's emissaries came to take a hostage, or at least this is what commentators at the time said, that one of John's emissaries came to take a hostage from the family based on some political need, which was not very uncommon, that you would have. You'd send a son to live at court who would kind of be a hostage, but also kind of be learning things at court. And that when Maud, when this was brought to her, she said in front of this noble, "I will not send my son to live with this man who so shamefully treated his own nephew that way."
Correct.
And that was
He kind of started the rumor. And so that got John all hot and bothered, and he got in an argument with William. And eventually he imprisons Maud and her oldest son, who there's some disagreement about how old he is. He probably is in his teens at the youngest. He might have been an adult, reaching an age of majority somewhere between 8 and 21 at this time. But he imprisons them both and gives them no food, which was a big no-no. And the son dies. And when they found Maud dead, she had actually resulted to cannibalism. Her son had died first, and she held him across her lap and ate part of his body. She ate from his cheek as a way to try to stay alive, but it wasn't enough, and she died. And so when the nobility heard about this, there was outrage at John's actions. This was just unthinkable that you would do something like this. Then later on, toward the end of his reign, it's in 1216, the Battle of Rochester, when the castle surrenders, maybe late 1215, sorry. He takes the nobles. It wasn't uncommon for common folk to be, sometimes you make a gesture where you hang some people to kind of send a message, that sort of thing. You typically don't do that to the nobility. He took the nobility that were in the castle and he cut off their hands and feet so they could never do anything again. And that was a huge, huge thing as well. And
it was the way that he did it as well, because if
Greg, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just want to ask Andrew or Jonathan, what do you think his relationship was with his brother Richard and his mother during the time? I know he had a good relationship with his father, but were they kind of at odds?
Do you want to take that one?
He stays pretty close with Eleanor. There's some pretty strong evidence that because and it's actually the battle in which he captures Arthur. Arthur has by that point aligned with the French king and with an army of troops is besieging Eleanor of Aquitaine in a castle in I think it's in Anjou, but I forget which castle off the top of my head. And this is John's arguably most effective military campaign, because he does a forced march with an army, covers miles in the middle of the night, ends up surprising Arthur and this force besieging the castle, destroys that army and captures Arthur.
1202, I think 1202, 1203.
Yeah, I think you're right. And this sort of ties in with, if he had killed Arthur during that fighting, probably no one would have said anything about it. It would have been unfortunate. It wasn't exactly playing by the rules, but it's a battle. Those things happen. But the fact that he imprisons Arthur and accepts him as an honorable prisoner, and then later Arthur dies. And I mean, Philip of France it totally was playing Arthur for his own benefit, and continued to do so long after Arthur would die, because or was probably dead, because routinely he would, when there was anything that John was trying to get, he would be like, yeah, sure, I'll make peace with you. Just do one thing for me. Provide Arthur. Show me that he's safe and alive.
Mm-hmm. Sergio, I think also to your question, I think Richard's actions show maybe more of that than what we would get from period sources. By the time Richard is nearing the middle part to the end part of his reign, John is definitely of age. He's definitely reached an age of majority where he could work. Richard spent all his time in France away from John in England. And when Richard was on crusade and when Richard was not there, it was Eleanor of Aquitaine that he was putting in charge of affairs for the kingdom, not John. And I think that speaks a lot. I think that they were two completely different people. I think Richard was confident and bellicose and could back every word that came out of his mouth. He could back it up. And I think John was the literal opposite of that. I think John had flashes of brilliance, but I think that he knew he could never compete with his brother in charisma and in ability. And so I think, history is largely quiet about their relationship, but I think looking at the periphery and the extra details, you can kind of get a picture there. I would say there wasn't a lot of trust.
I'm a John here. I have to defend the name, but why didn't John go on crusade?
That's a really good question. So
he's going to go on crusade, but then he never does.
He doesn't go with Richard because he is the heir to the throne at that point. And there is some suggestion at a couple of points during Henry II's lifetime and later that John offered up to the Pope to go on crusade, and the Pope thought, hey, this is a great idea. But
in 1213 when he offers to go.
But family politics basically dissuade him from doing that. And then at the very end of his reign, he actually makes England a fief of the papacy.
That's in 1213. That is.
Yep. And he will say, oh yeah, I will go on crusade. But he is, he's dead before that could ever happen. And he's under threat and under invasion by Louis of France and the rebellion of his own barons at that point. There's a lot of arguing that John does this as a political move, and we'll talk about this with the church a little bit. It's hard to look into people's hearts in the past, but John does flip around his views on the church a couple of times for some political benefit. So there's two pieces to Richard and John's relationship that are interesting. One of them is definitely Richard makes John his heir. He could have made Arthur his heir. He could have made other individuals his heirs. He did not have any children through his marriage himself, but he very clearly gives that to John. So for better or for worse, He must have thought John had the best chances at the time of actually ruling as king. When Richard comes back from Crusade, and John's attempts to seize control in England are more subtle than sort of the Robin Hood story would probably lead you to believe. But when he comes back and takes power, he immediately forgives John. And the quote that's used in the commentaries is that Richard tells John, "I understand, but you are just a child and you were misled by your advisors." And John is like 30.
I was about to say, at this point, he's in his early 30s.
At that point. So there's both he's not totally pushing John away, but he's also, this is very much an older, younger brother kind of setup between the two of them. Okay, so another.
Can I also ask?
Yes, please.
Please.
I would kind of put some light into the relationship. Like, isn't that John offered a bribe to Henry IV to keep Richard in captivity? The German emperor. I mean, that must be, pretty bad.
He does, but he doesn't even do it very well. He at some points is kind of working to help with paying off the bribe, and at other points, or the ransom, correct. And at other points he is physically trying to sort of up the ante. And Henry the Lion will have nothing of that. Philip of England will write John a letter saying the devil is loose when Richard is actually released. So clearly there's some conspiracy between the French royal family and John himself over the issue. But at the same time, or shortly after that, when John goes and forgives him, or I'm sorry, Richard comes and forgives John and says, "You just had bad advisors, you're just a child," John will lead a force to capture a nearby castle. And the commentators at the time make it pretty clear that the way that he captured this was basically by walking in saying, "Hey, I'm still on your side," and then unleashing his troops to slaughter everyone who was inside. So John is as soon as that element of sort of force comes in, he switches backsides to Richard, but does not do it in a sort of an above board kind of way.
This is kind of a little bit of a daft analogy, but John is the kid on the playground who is always changing the rules so that he can win. He always wants to change the rules to be in his favor, and nobody wants to play with him because of it. And it ends up not going well for him. Some of which we're about to see here in his relation to the church, and particularly with the Pope, starting 1205-ish and beyond.
And I'm not sure any of the siblings in this family had any kind of normal filial relationship, because all four of these sons, Henry, Richard, Geoffrey, and John, all are involved in rebellions against their father. All of them are involved against rebellions against each other, switching sides back and forth at various points. In this family, what was prized was your ability to hold and maintain power. And so
John also was involved. I thought he was favored.
Yeah, I thought he was Henry's favorite son. If
you've seen
everything you've said, this is another John here protecting a John. Everything you said is kind of small beer within the aristocracy. So he murders people. They all murdered people. I mean, Richard killed 3,000 Muslims at Acre in cold blood when hostage negotiations went badly, and he's a hero of English history. John murdered a few people. None of these people were innocent.
They all
wanted power.
No, I take your point really, really well. But to the medieval mind, the vast difference is that Richard killed prisoners when the person that he was in diplomacy with violated the terms of their diplomacy, whereas John killed a family member who was being held for ransom as an honorable prisoner.
And in the what we'll see in a little bit, killing his barons and killing the family members of his barons, that was a big no-no. These are people that are technically supposed to be under your protection, not only by the law, but also by the code of chivalry, also by tradition within England for going back, I mean, at least 200 years at that point, maybe more. And so in some ways it may have been a way that they could use something against John, but it wasn't the killing that was the problem. It was who he killed, how he killed, and the degree to which he did it.
I do this tongue in cheek to some extent, but you could
but
argue that John just believed that all lives were equally valued, nobles as well as vassals.
Given some of John's actions against individuals who weren't noble,
yeah, I might disagree a little.
That would be a little bit inconsistent, but I guess the best way that I could describe it, and you're not, I mean, you're not wrong. Medieval people expected their kings to be cruel. John was cruel and nasty.
Yeah.
By the way, if I could comment here, I was just reading Beowulf, which goes back a few hundred years, but was written down about 1000 AD, not that long before. And you're right, killing a family member was really bad. Killing your enemies, of course, was fine, or killing people in fights or one thing or another. Killing family members was evil. And also treating nobility. I mean, if nobility, unless it was a war enemy, nobility, you were expected to respect nobility.
And nobody would have had a problem with John cutting down Arthur on the battlefield, possibly even after he surrendered. I mean, within 2 generations, you have examples like Edward I cutting down Simon de Montfort on the battlefield and having him butchered. And there's nothing really untoward about that. It was in battle. That was an accepted part of battle. John takes them prisoner, holds them prisoner for a couple of months, and then either has them killed or they starve to death, and that's where that line kind of is.
Right.
Can I also ask one more question? I think from what I read, if I remember correctly, that one of the reasons he lost most of his lands in France is because the way he treated the nobles of Brittany, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine. That's why it's not just Arthur. Arthur was Duke of Brittany,
yes.
right? I think.
Yes.
And Arthur, by the way, he probably had claims for the throne, right? He was son of Henry.
Oh, very much so.
Yeah. A quite strong claim, actually.
Especially by
older brother,
sort of
Henry.
Traditional European models, he would have been a more natural choice, but that wasn't set in stone in England because he was the eldest son of an older son.
Quick question. What was the culture like that John was in? Was it essentially a French culture?
It would have been Anglo-Norman.
Yes.
Which is by this point, the sort of Norman French culture of William the Conqueror and the invaders is mixing with the English culture of Anglo-Saxon England. And it's kind of its own beast. And John probably would have been able to read and speak in English.
And French, yes.
He certainly would have been able to do it in Norman French.
Yes.
And he certainly was able to do it in Latin. John was the best educated of all of his siblings. He's actually educated in a nunnery.
Occitan too, right?
Spend much time in England, and it's thought that he did not speak English. Is that correct?
Right. Richard was definitely the more French of the two. One of the things too, Paul, kind of answer your question, I'll jump out a little bit here. In Magna Carta, we start to get the first hints of what we would know as nationalism. I don't think you can go that far yet to say that it is like full-blown nationalism, but John makes such a use of French mercenaries that his English barons, one of the hallmarks of Magna Carta is that they talk about aliens and they talk about foreign powers that come in and are involved. And so clearly, to some degree, there's beginning to be an English identity, at least within the nobility, definitely so within the common people, I would argue, but we don't have a lot of information about them. So I would say, what's the culture? Definitely still has some French flair. I mean, this is, again, part of the reason we have so many French words and French derivatives in modern English, is because it was a part of the court language for so long. But I do think that there is beginning to be a distinct English identity, and this is probably one of the earlier points where that is really taking hold. That's my view anyway.
Yeah,
John-
Norman French is still the language, the court language. Absolutely.
John, I have a question. Sorry, Andrew. Sorry.
No, by all means.
Not a question, but I don't know, the story about Blondale, the troubadour that found Richard the Lionheart due to the singing that he was doing behind a wall. Was it a true story or was just something that made up?
We don't have any facts, but it has a lot of great truth to it. I mean, Richard did write songs. There are songs that, tunes today of songs that Richard wrote that have been reused. Eleanor of Aquitaine, his mother, is responsible for the start of troubadour culture in France. That's her world.
She's a granddaughter, right, of the Duke who was a famous poet. Right?
She was a serious figure in her own right, perhaps one of the most powerful women in all of Middle Ages.
And for those that have seen the movie Lion in Winter, the history is bad, but the interactions between all of the people is just so wonderful that I absolutely love it. I think they got the personalities dialed in pretty well, with the exception of it is highly unlikely in any way, shape, or form that Richard I was homosexual. There's just no historic evidence for that. They certainly knew what it was at the time. There's lots of historic evidence for other English monarchs, but not Richard. That seems to be a modern misinterpretation.
Yeah, I heard that he had an intimate relationship with Philip II.
So that's where the story comes from, because the two of them shared a bed together. But in this case, it's literally the act of sharing a bed. The two men sleeping in a bed would not have been thought of in a sexual way to the medieval mind. I mean, the same type of arguments are made about Abraham Lincoln, who, when he
That
wrote
was my
Circuit,
thought exactly. He
slept
shared
in a bed with his law partner. Well, yeah, that's what you did in a hotel in the 19th century in the United States.
Furniture was very expensive.
The very fact that it was a hunting trip and the French king had a bed brought with him. I mean, the idea of traveling beds, your average peasant, you can argue, didn't have a bed as we would recognize it today. They had a piece of furniture they slept on, but to actually have a made camp bed would have been a sign of having a, well, and we'll talk about money and purchasing power.
Significant wealth, yeah.
All right, I'm going to do a really quick lightning view of troubles with the church. English monarchs, Henry II particularly, John himself, often get into trouble when it's time to pick a new Archbishop of Canterbury, because the Archbishop of Canterbury is probably the second most powerful person in England next to the king. Popes, during this time period, are starting to fight the fight over whether things like major archbishops are political appointees by kings or whether they are ecclesiastical appointees by the papacy, which is not simply based on theology, it's also based on practical political power as well. And the fight over issues with the church is going to get John into a lot of hot water.
Yeah, big trouble.
And then he's going to get himself out of it again in what is often argued as his most astute political move, which in the end really actually had no effect for him whatsoever. So the time comes to appoint a new Archbishop of Canterbury. John has his appointees. The monks of Canterbury have their own choice. The monks steal a march on John. They end up in Rome. The Pope basically realizes fairly early on that their choice is not the king's choice, admonishes them for that. John puts his own person forward and the Pope says, I don't care, I've got my own guy. I'm going to make Stephen Langdon Archbishop of Canterbury. Stephen Langdon was absolutely brilliant. He is responsible for laying out the Bible in chapter and verse as we use it today. He is responsible, as we'll talk later, are probably responsible for actually writing Magna Carta, and was just an amazingly smart guy. But John didn't want him as his archbishop. And so what ends up happening is there's a standoff between John and the Pope from 1208 to 1213, and England is under interdict. And what that means is There are no church services. There is no burial in consecrated ground. The communion cannot be given. Essentially, the only, if I believe correctly, the only sacrament still allowed was baptism.
Infant baptism.
Infant baptism.
And that's it. Yeah.
Because this is also the period where if an infant dies without being baptized, it is damned. There's if you are not baptized, you do not go to heaven, full stop. That is the view of this world. So John then decides, well, if there's an interdict, then all of those officials in the church who have all of these lands and money, well, they're no longer doing anything for my country, and it's just England at this point. He's lost his overseas lands, and he just begins confiscating all their valuables. And
quick side note, at this time in history, the general estimates are that the church owned about 25% of the land, arable land anyway, in England during John's reign. So for him to seize those lands, it's a pretty big power grab. Sorry, Andrew, go ahead.
Now, I have to say, one of my, probably the most clever things that John did as a politician is one of the ways he secures some of this funding. He holds for ransom the wives and concubines of the church figures who aren't supposed,
housemaids of the bishops.
Yes, who are not supposed to have them to begin with. So they can't even really argue that what you're doing is unfair. So I will definitely grant that one to John. That was,
and to the Pope's dismay, the bishops seemingly hurried to pay the ransom for these ladies.
So this continues until 1213. And at that point, things have broken down where John is fearing a French invasion. And he knows, if the Pope is against me and the French are going to invade me and I'm excommunicated, this could very easily turn into a crusade against England. Because by that point, crusades had begun being used by the papacy for issues of heresy, like with the Cathars in France and Spain, and sometimes for, we would think today, political ends. Not that the Eastern Crusades weren't political either. But in order to forestall that, John does a complete 180 and immediately becomes a vassal of the Pope and makes England a papal fief, which means, officially at least, the country of England becomes the Pope's land under John as a vassal to a lord. And it is enough for, I mean, Pope Innocent III completely reverses his view of John. John is now the protector of the church. John can do no wrong. There is interdicts placed against the Capetian family as they try to invade England. Politically, it doesn't do any good for John, but his actions toward the church are very political and very cynical. That's part of medieval rule, but he never quite gets the tone right and never seems to quite be able to pull it off.
I think also it's really interesting as a final slight to Langton. He never liked Langton. He would never get on board with him. And as a final slight to him at the siege of Rochester in 1216, he stables his horses in the cathedral, which is, I mean, today that would be something that you would look at and go, ooh, that's not a good thing. And in this time period, that was outright sacrilege. So
the point was made in chat that John's father had his own troubles with the church, and not to pull up great old movies, but if you want to go back to Thomas a Becket, yes, Henry II certainly did have problems with the church. The big difference between Henry and his son is that Henry managed the spin. And the way that he managed that spin, and it was actually during his son's rebellions that he prostrated himself where Thomas Becket had been killed and allowed the monks to beat him on the back. And the very next day, his forces won a military victory. That just, he used it as a political showpiece. John never managed to pull that kind of stuff off.
So let's just let me ask a question about the viewpoint of the Pope.
Sure.
So the Pope is dealing with this. The Pope is also actively in warfare against Frederick II throughout this entire period, who he's also excommunicating.
Yes.
and actually threatens him geographically.
The Pope, and at this point, it's Innocent III, and he is nobody to be trifled with. There's a kind of argument among scholars about this, but Innocent III is probably the pinnacle of papal power throughout the Middle Ages. He is really sharp, and he is a political master. And I mean, anybody who's read a little bit about Frederick II, you'll know how serious of a figure he was. I mean, he was a titan in his own right. And to be able to go toe to toe with him took somebody pretty special as far as ability goes. And so the Pope, I guess kind of the analogy that's often used is that it's a chess game that's always being played across this board of Europe. And the Pope is definitely trying to play those figures. Paul, to your point, for sure, he's definitely trying to play those as he moves along. He's moving from one crisis to another, just trying to manage and hold it all together. So
if you could say anything negative about him, it might be that he used excommunication a little bit too much. And so it lost a little bit of the sting. By the time John was excommunicated, Frederick had been excommunicated. I think Otto had been excommunicated. So there's like a bad boys excommunicate of Europe club going on.
Yep. And none of them were really, like you said, it kind of lost the sting, Andrew. None of them were really afraid of that anymore. They knew they could get back in his good graces. So very, very interesting. As we kind of move on to the next part about how we judge John, one of the things that was important for kings is that you needed to be kingly. You needed to carry that air about you. And so it was really important. It's okay to be rich. You're supposed to have money. You're supposed to spend money. You're supposed to flaunt your wealth a little bit. That's something that in the medieval mind is not only okay or encouraged, but that it's something that kings are supposed to do. You're not kingly if you don't. Now, one of the problems with John is that he had no problem displaying grandeur, but he often did it without honor. There was no chivalry in the way that he interacted and used his wealth. And for the barons, the things that they highlighted themselves in Magna Carta that were the biggest problems, number one was something called scootage. And scootage is a tax that is levied on nobles when the king wants to go to war. Now, you have 40 days of feudal service that, if as your noble, that's due to your overlord. And for your biggest nobles, their only overlord is the king. And so they're going to war for the king 40 days a year. Now, they can show up and do that service, or they can pay someone else to go and do that in their stead, okay? And oftentimes, the fee for this was around 20 marks, was kind of what was common in the reign of Henry II, which is a decent chunk of change, but it's definitely not going to break the bank for any of these guys. It's kind of a minor blip on the radar. That's a tough month as opposed to a tough quarter or something like that. They'll recover just fine. But the problem with John, Henry II, in his 34-year reign, he only levied scootage 8 times. John levied scootage 11 times in 16 years, in half that amount of time. And he kept raising the rates of scootage when he levied. And to the point where you get some of these minor nobles whose overlords are coming to them for money that they have to then in turn give to John. And these guys are starting to be broken. They're going, I can't pay this. You have your average barons who are going, this is getting too much. I'm not able to raise this money. I can't pay it. It's beginning to impact their bottom line. And it's beginning to cause a problem in the community that they have. Because something that's really important to remember is that these lords are not just living isolated atop this pyramid. They are at the top of the pyramid, and there's a whole structure underneath them. But technically, according to law, according to chivalric code, and according to the tradition of the time, they are responsible for all of these people that are underneath them. And they have to establish and maintain a certain order, a certain schedule, a certain way of life. Because without them, everybody that's underneath them can't achieve a meaningful life in their view at all. So
John here, so we got Magna Carta because the barons were upset with John's marginal tax rates. I use the term marginal loosely. Is that?
That's one.
If I could comment, I think that's absolutely correct. One of the factors was, as you say, the knights owed military service to the king, but they could pay money instead. Well, John decided he was not interested in their military service. He wanted the money. And I think one of the provisions of the Magna Carta is if a knight wants to do military service, he can do it and not pay the money. So yeah, that was a critical. John wanted the money. He didn't care about military. He was much less interested in military service.
There were several occasions where he called up a levy and then dismissed the levy, forcing everyone to pay their scutage.
After taking all the money, there's a great example of this in 1204 at Portsmouth, where he calls up his earls and his barons, and they think they're going to France for the 40 days. Okay, so they show up at Portsmouth, which is the south of England. It's the port. They're going to sail out up to France, and they get there, and he says, "Guys, I've got some good news. You don't have to go to France." They're all relieved. Okay, I don't want to leave and go far away from home. I'm trying to manage crises in my own area. But he says, you don't get to go home until you give me every red cent you have in your pocket. And these guys had come with a lot of their property, a lot of their, a lot of their retainers themselves. They had come with a lot of money because they're going overseas. And so John says that he's levying scutage, but the scutage is going to be what everybody has on him at the time. And if you think you're going to serve for 40 days overseas, you're bringing more than you would if you're going a 15-day ride from your home. So,
and this is above and in addition to the standard taxes. So
Correct.
Although it seems marginal to us today, and I mean, you can make the case that that medieval barons used the term "my rights" the way that you might be able to more appropriately title "my privileges." Right. You can certainly make that case, but not only are they having to pay these extra military fees, but they're having to pay them to reclaim all the lands in Normandy that John has already lost.
Correct.
And most of the time they're paying it, the campaigns don't happen, and there's no benefit to it anyway. So it's the 11th time that you've had to pay the king extra money that you're not normally supposed to have to pay him. And there's been no gain the other 10 times.
After he lost lands that were producing you money. So you lost money when you lost your lands. Every 3 out of 4 years, he's coming to take extra money on top of your taxes that he's already taking. So
I don't mean to sound like a Marxist, but the barons fleece the peasants for centuries. And then you get a king who wants to fleece the barons. What is so wrong about this?
I don't know that it's necessarily quite that simple. There were some barons that were not great, but there's not a huge record of barons fleecing peasants. Barons lost a lot of money in the years just leading up to John's reign. Also in John's reign, within the first about 5 to 6 years, you get a massive inflation where the price of just about everything doubles, especially food.
All of feudalism was just an institutionalization of basically a mafia style government.
So,
it was private,
right, but
forces.
I think we need to make one. I think one
Mm-hmm.
point needs to be made, and I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole because it's a 3-hour talk itself. Feudalism is not a form of government.
No.
Okay, so feudalism, but taxes are a governmental system. Feudalism is a system for raising armies for the field based on a cavalry force. And so the problem that many of the individuals that John is angering have is the same type of problem they had with his killing of Arthur. It's not that kings tax, because kings do tax. Everybody understands kings tax. Kings kill their enemies. Everybody understands kings kill their enemies, but there are rules that we all know that we follow when that happens. And John keeps breaking the rules. So at some point, we need to list out what the rules are, and by military might make the king agree to them, so that we have some way of preventing the rules from constantly being changed from here on out. I'm not going to say that every baron treated their peasants well.
Right.
Because that certainly is not the case. There were some barons who treated their peasants absolutely terribly. The peasants in general did not have the military might to change or force those changes on the barons. The barons certainly had the military might eventually to try to force that change on the king.
Right.
So it's not a morality play. necessarily.
No.
If I could respond to John, yeah, the Magna Carta was not a great triumph of human rights, as it's sometimes mentioned to be. It was a fight between the king and the barons, and when the barons got the other hand, they said to the king, "You have to promise not to do this." And it was purely a fight, who wins and who loses. It wasn't so much. I mean, it was, as you say, the barons were insisting on their traditional thing, and I think most of the provisions, or a lot of provision, maybe most of them on the Magna Carta, is you can only charge this much as an inheritance tax. You can only charge this much for a marriage tax. So it was, but it was pure. It wasn't, you're right, these weren't really humanitarian principles. These were just the fight for power. What rights did the barons have relative to the king? Thanks.
And John, maybe one of the best ways to answer your question is, I don't know that, for me anyway, I don't know that I'm equipped to judge John. I don't have the medieval mindset. I didn't live in that time. I don't know that I'm qualified to do that. But what I do know is that all of his chroniclers, his contemporary chroniclers, all of whom were churchmen, who, if they were worth their salt, were supposed to side with the Pope, all wrote negative critiques about John, which flew in the face of their ultimate overlord. So to some degree,
they were all invested in the aristocratic system.
And I certainly don't disagree with any of that perspective, but that's a tale of human nature throughout time.
I have a question, Andrew and Jonathan. Maybe you can answer this. I was reading Magna Carta, and there's a section on Jews where it says, if a person dies, right, his wife does not have to pay an interest to a Jew, or doesn't have to pay on a principal and all forgiven. What is such a targeting of Jews?
Okay. How long do we have? In short,
not enough time to give this question real.
In short, Jews in England fall personally under the purview of the king, because they were originally invited as an ethnic and religious group to England under, and I can't remember which king made the invitation. It is one of Henry's predecessors. But the impact that has on law is that Jews in England are protected by the king throughout this period. Because of Christian interpretations of issues like money lending and usury, Christians are not supposed to lend money at interest, which makes it really hard to run a business of money lending. And there are projects that just need some sort of capital to run. And so that often falls under the purview of the Jewish community because they don't have the same religious restrictions. It's an opportunity open to them. Largely as a social and ethnic group, they were of slightly higher financial status when they, at least those that came to England were, and so had the capital to be able to do that. So the issue is, if you have lent money to a Jewish person, and then either of you dies, because Jews are under the protection of the king has a vested interest then in whether or not that debt is paid. And that can then be sold by the king to someone else. That debt can be sold off by the king. And so it became a quick way for kings to make money to sell off those debts. And it becomes so bad that during Edward I's reign, he essentially calls in all of those debts. And when they can't be paid, kicks all the Jews out of England. That's in short why that is such a connection with the king. It's because at that time in English history, Jews are personally under the protection of the king, and they are connected in with how the king raises money, and those debts then get sold off. And so restricting the cost of the sale of those debts is what Magna Carta is trying to get at
least in that regard, yes.
Yes.
So kind of looking back, John was known to tax his barons relentlessly. One of the bigger problems with the taxes is they were always paying money into campaigns that he lost. In 1211, he raised 81,000 pounds, which was 2.5 times his normal income, his annual income. This is a huge amount of money. Historians, to some degree, can't figure out where that amount of money came from, but he found it.
Because
And
it's
then,
physical coin. It's
right,
not
exactly.
theoretical numbers. This is literal coin.
Exactly. All in the form of pennies, by the way, because there was nothing else minted in England at this time. So 81,000 pounds sterling in pennies. And in 1214, just before the Battle of Bouvines, he has 200,000 marks in the bank. And then he goes and squanders all of it in about 5 months' time, which just leaves a real bad taste in everybody's mouth. Some of the other problems that they had with him is that they would say that he did not have the honor that kings are supposed to have. I would kind of term this section of argument that they viewed him as a frat boy king. It's expected that kings are going to sleep with other women. They're going to have concubines. Henry II had 25 illegitimate sons. So, I mean, that was something that was expected. However,
one of whom is one of John's leading supporters to a point.
Yes, was
before he
William
switches
Longsword.
over.
Yeah,
Yep.
one of his,
I must say, every single male noble had the right to his vassals' women at the time.
I have not read that, and this was a big. Doesn't mean it's not real, but this was a big problem with his nobles, that he was going after the wives and daughters of their own wives and daughters. And a decent example of this comes from a guy named Eustace de Vesey, who lived in the north of England, and in 1211, John's court came to his castle, and at this time, when John is staying there, John insists that Eustace's wife come to his bed while he is staying there. She declines. John is not happy about that. Around that same time, John also reportedly, maybe slightly earlier, seduced Matilda, Robert Fitzwalter's daughter. There's a lot of shadowy stuff around that, but that's kind of the rumor that goes around. And you have Eustace and Robert, who are the chief engineers of the Barons' Rebellion, beginning in 1215. They tried to get it started in 1212, just a few months after John had been at de Vesey's court. So there's
at least one argument that Eustace and Robert may have made up the stories as weapons against John.
Correct.
But if they did, they were believable enough against John that they convinced people. So whether they were true or not, everybody thought John certainly capable of those actions.
And all but one or two of the historians I've read do believe that they're credible.
Yeah.
So some of the other stuff that he did, one of his own kind of bannermen in France, Hugh de Lusignan, the ninth, he was engaged to Isabella of Angoulême. John came through, saw her, liked her, stole her out from underneath him. This would not have been a big problem if he had said, hey, I'll give you a little money because I kind of messed up this deal that you had, showed a little grace with that. But instead, he didn't. He just explained that this was what he was going to do, and then bragged about it to the rest of the French nobles and the English court. And he made an enemy of Hugh de Lusignan the ninth for the rest of his life. One of the other mistakes that John made that was pointed out, it wasn't necessarily a reason for Magna Carta, but it was pointed out as a real problem by the nobles, is that he surrounded himself with exclusively knight bachelors and mercenaries. Now, there's some argument to be made that the nobles weren't able to have the ear of the king, and that's part of the argument, part of the problem, and that's probably true. But also, John surrounded himself with young men and who knew nothing about decision-making, who knew nothing about how to command military matters, and then he surrounded himself with mercenaries who were available to the highest bidder. If someone else had come along and said, I'll pay you more than what John's paying you, they would have dropped him in a heartbeat, and in some cases they did. And we'll see one of those in a minute.
Just to comment on that,
yes.
I think there was a sense that mercenaries were much better than the knight levies, the levies of knights. Mercenaries would do what they were told. If you had a baron who sent his knights out to fight for you, they didn't care about the fight. They had a certain power of their own. So mercenaries were, if you wanted a disciplined army, disciplined, skilled army, mercenaries were much better than the feudal knight levies.
Well, that's been true for thousands of years, is that kings and emperors prefer mercenaries because they have no local connections, they don't have powerful family networks, and they have nowhere else to go, so they obey. the king's orders. So
And-
that's nothing new. I mean,
But where this is different,
And that was remarked on at the time with John. John, you absolutely nailed that. It was a commonly held belief, even at the time, that the reason he relied so heavily on mercenaries is that he didn't feel he could trust his actual, barons and earls, which was probably true. But
and in the historiography, the other side of the coin would say that it's because he lacked such a skill in building relationships with these people that there was no trust. Because you have other places in Europe at the time where that is able to happen with relative success. Now, mercenaries, to Ralph's point as well, mercenaries were definitely preferred for heavy infantry, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But they're really expensive, and you want mercenaries for campaign use. Where John broke the mold and did something that was a little bit different is he paid mercenaries for years to hold important castles, to be military advisors, to run campaigns that in all other respects and purposes would have normally been led by nobles.
and a lot of his mercenaries are in fact knights from the Low Countries and France. So that it's not just, Snuffy with a spear and a shield. He's employing, certainly crossbowmen are arguably one of the most common mercenary types in Europe around at the time. But a lot of the mercenaries that he employs are knights themselves.
Correct. Who would have been younger sons from families who aren't getting any inheritance, that sort of thing. Two other things to hit really quickly that I think are important. There are two stories that occur in the chroniclers at the time. The wife of Hugh de Neville begged him she said, I'll give you 200 chickens just to have a single night with my husband. And we don't know if that means because he was sort of Andrew had mentioned that he could have been a captive to the court, meaning that John was kind of holding him there to do duties or whatnot, but he was actually just playing a game trying to make someone miserable. Or perhaps that Hugh de Neville's wife was held at the court and was willing to do anything to just get home to her own people. Also, Robert de Vere, the Earl of Oxford at the time, who's quite a powerful Earl. He apparently has had an affair with someone that it would not be good if it got out that he had an affair with this person. John somehow found out about it and then charged him 5 palfreys, a type of horse, or palfreys, to keep quiet about the affair. And it's not necessarily that it's not the horses themselves, but it's the act that the king will look at someone there's supposed to be a mutual respect and trust between, and all he wants to do is try to embarrass him and dominate him in that way. I think maybe one of the most telling things is that when rebellion breaks out, John pretty much has the advantage from the beginning. He has the advantage over his barons. He has 6 of the most powerful lords on his side up until about 1217. And even though it looks like John has a significant advantage over the barons, a third of his royal household abandons him at the drop of a hat as soon as they learn that that rebellion is afoot.
And a lot of those are those younger knights who, as was mentioned, sort of follow the pathway of family connections or things of that nature, because John is no longer able to provide for them at court what they expected as household knights.
Correct.
I hope we hear down the road, John may be the Donald Trump of his time, I grant you that, but how were the people of England doing? Were things immeasurably bad?
So the people of England at the start of John's reign were doing amazingly well. The lifestyle, even for the lowest of the low in England at the start of John's reign, was arguably significantly better than in most other areas of Europe. And one of the reasons of that was, Henry II and Richard I get a lot of criticism. They're kings of England. They spend all their time in France. True. John was a king of England who spent all his time in England because he lost France. And there was nothing to protect England as a buffer zone from the actions then of the French royal family, and life was significantly harder for those in England. So that area of France that is under control, that's the sort of the marches, the border area that's helping kings of England keep England as a very wealthy and very effective society up before John. And they struggle after that to have England as its own insular society be as successful as it was prior. So yeah, life and Jonathan has some really good, figures on.
Yeah, we're going to get there in just a minute.
Yeah, standard of living and economy. But we often criticize, well, Richard I didn't speak English. Well, none of his ancestors that have been kings or queens of England up to that point spoke English at court either. That's no different. So why does he get judged more harshly for that? Well, Richard I spent all his time in France. Well, yes, but he was fighting campaigns that were in fact in the best interest of England as a nation. So it's more complicated than sometimes the simple answers. So John is a warrior. We already talked about launching ambushes on people who think that you are on their own side. He was his campaigns against the Welsh, who are a constant enemy to the English crown up through the Edwards, were largely successful. But he also relied on some heavy lifters, his barons and earls that were along the Welsh marches, managed a lot of those campaigns. In fact, William Marshall, who we'll talk a little bit about later on, is largely absent from most of the actual fighting of the rebellion because he is by himself and, well, with his own feudal forces, holding down the Welsh marches and preventing that from being a problem. His campaigns in France, they often do not go well. He loses Normandy, he loses Aquitaine. Well, he loses Normandy with the exception of Calais. He loses Anjou and Aquitaine with the exception of a lot of the coastal cities, La Rochelle, and such. Loses the traditional home of the Dukes of Normandy, Rouen. So kind of fails in maintaining the lands that he gains at becoming king. He tries to play some of the political games that his father and his uncle had played in terms of making strong relationships with other leaders across Europe. It culminates in the Battle of Bouvines in 1214, which is arguably one of the largest and most pivotal battles in medieval European history.
Yes, it's large.
Especially for the time. John himself is not at Bouvines. His brother-in-law, William Longespee, or William of Salisbury, is commanding the English forces there. It is a narrowly run battle. It could have gone either way, but Philip of France is successful. It almost did. I think Philip is unhorsed 3 times, although everybody in antiquity or medieval sources gets unhorsed 3 times. It's a good number for getting unhorsed, but he certainly was unhorsed, saved by his armor and his bodyguard. We'll talk a little bit more about the tactical and military side of things later, but there's a lot of interplay between infantry and mounted knights. Mounted knights get a really bad reputation for being hotheads who ride off to do single combat, particularly in France and Germany. There was a lot more organization and tactical skill than we often attribute to them. The English knights were not thought of as being the best horsemen, but were noted for being able to fight very bravely and particularly fighting on foot. But sort of more on that later. So in terms of sort of holding that kingship job of being the warrior king, John is not successful, particularly at that either. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with suffering at any of these points at kingship if you're still able to maintain your nation is not the sort of the wrong word because we're not dealing with nations yet.
Maintain the relationships that are necessary with your barons.
Exactly. You can make the case. I mean, Philip of France was not a warrior king. He was fat. He was arguably not a particularly bold fighter personally, unlike, say, Richard I, who was noted for being a battlefield warrior. But Philip of France was able to plan campaigns or listen to advisors to actually make military campaigns that worked. And John routinely spurned advice from his subordinates who kind of knew better in terms of planning.
And one of those, we're going to kind of hop over this bit about mercenaries here for a second, so that we can talk about one of those folks that Andrew's talking about, and that's William Marshall. I love William Marshall. The only person I know who loves William Marshall more than me is Andrew.
Yeah, I'm kind of a fanboy of William Marshall. So William Marshall, at his death, we're pulling Archbishop Langdon back again. Archbishop Langdon supposedly said that so dies the greatest knight who has ever lived, which is pretty high praise for the Archbishop of Canterbury to give to a single man. One of the things that's fascinating about William Marshall, and I promised that I would keep this short because otherwise I'll talk about him all night, is that one of his family members had a biography written in verse of his life story. And so we have a lot more information about this man's life than we do many of his contemporaries. And he goes from being a second son who's not going to inherit, his father was a minor lord, but he's not going to inherit any of those lands. He's a second son. So it goes from, I mean, still of the knightly class, and he's still sent off to learn how to be a knight. So we're not talking destitute here, but he goes from there to being, by his death, regent of England, at least till just shortly before his death. So this is a meteoric rise from, you know, he's sort of born into the influential people of the world, but fairly low down. And by the end of his life, he is as high as you can be without actually being a monarch. And he does it largely through skill, a lot of luck, and he plays all these points well. He builds a military family that follows him to the very end. His chief right-hand man, when he has become the Earl of Pembroke, was his squire growing up. And so he makes those connections and keeps those connections.
But it serves him well, serves him really well.
They really do. And that you can make a strong case that he's responsible for John being king. Because when Richard I dies, William Marshall is basically engaged in a conversation with some of the other influential movers and shakers in Anglo-Norman society. And basically, William Marshall says, "I'm supporting John." And the passage that's given in his biography is that basically, we agree with you, but this is a mistake that you will rue for the rest of your life. And so Marshall really is an early backer to John. He helps John secure the treasury early on when John's first taking reign. And everything sort of goes downhill from there. He serves as one of John's principal military commanders in the fall of Normandy. He later on, he is going to be connected with the de Bros, the family whose the mother and son starved to death. He essentially is going to give them up to the king eventually, but at least early on has some connections with trying to protect them from him. He is pulled into John's court and humiliated by John on several of occasions. But you can make a case that the reason England as a standalone country exists today is because William Marshall stayed true to John and continued to back John and his family despite everything else that was going on. As for why he did that, there is an intangible that I can't provide an answer for. It is possibly that he just felt, as he was responsible for putting John on the throne, that he was going to see it through. By the end of his life, William Marshall was known as a person of his word. If he said he was on your side and you could trust him, then he was on your side and you could trust him. There are some historians that paint him as very money and power hungry. That was an expected part of his role in society, was to be money and power hungry. So very different to the medieval mind maybe than to us today. But I find his story absolutely fascinating.
Mm-hmm. I think too, one of the really interesting things is that when Marshall had fallen out of favor for a period from about 1207 to 1212, there's record of John's Knights Bachelors who were in his ear. Basically, John surrounded himself with yes men. That's kind of the antithesis to William, who in the Middle Ages, you had to be careful. You didn't surround yourself with people who were as competent or more competent than you because they could burn you. But William Marshall seemed to do that, partially because maybe he was just very skilled in this way, but also people genuinely had an affection for him, or at least it appears that they had a genuine affection for him. And so he was able to surround himself with competent people. And that's one of the arguments from the historians for how he was able to survive the wrath of the king in the way that he did, was that he was such a figure. He was a beloved figure. He surrounded himself with other competent people who had his back. And when the king and he were not on good terms, John's Knight Bachelors, the sycophants that were kind of in his corner would all agree with John. Oh yes, King, you did the great thing, the right thing. But none of them were willing to challenge William Marshall to a judicial duel. None of them had the guts to stand up against him in trial by combat of any kind. And a big part of that is because William Marshall made his name on the tournament field of Europe, particularly in France, in England also, but in France in the generation prior to that. So
and he's ballpark 60 years old by the time of Magna Carta. He is not a young man,
no.
And he's still leading troops on the battlefield. I only hope to be in as good a health.
And nobody, even at 60 years old, at this point, like combat is a young man's game in a lot of ways, but nobody wants to see him show up on the battlefield. And even to the point into his 60s, when he does show up, people leave. They're not willing to face him. This is his effigy in Temple Church, London. If any of you have ever been to London, or you will go soon, go to Temple Church and you can see him there. Magna Carta, just really quick. Andrew, I think you're going to take a few things here. But one of the things to me that's really important is that most of the things that it talks about are financial issues. Capping an inheritance tax, which is called relief. Capping scutage, how many times can we levy it? We have to set a price on it. And then a big deal about Magna Carta, and this is kind of the first time this had ever been encoded into law. Two things. Number one is protection against unlawful imprisonment. That comes directly from John's treatment of Maud de Brioze, and the nobles, even 8 to 10 years after this, are still really bothered by this. And so that makes it into codified law, which is a big deal. And then the other thing is a right to trial by peers, which is something that they had always, I think for probably a generation or two, something that had been a hoped for thing. It became an opportunity with Magna Carta to see that happen. And also, John was not known for being quite lawful in his judgment when it came to nobles. So that's part of that.
And remember, these are barons that are working with Stephen Langdon to draft this up. So when they're talking about peers, it is the same way that you would talk about the peers in the House of Lords today.
Correct.
They're not thinking of peers as being, the guy who lives next door to me.
No.
Probably is a peasant and is going to be, holding rank over me. So one of the interesting things about Magna Carta is, particularly in the United States, it is venerated for things that it never was really intended to be at the time it was written, and for meanings that it didn't really have at the time that it was written, but was flexible enough to be used as a symbol of those further along. And so those pieces. Go ahead.
Guys, if I could, I'd like to push back a little bit on that.
Sure.
Paragraph 30, clause 39 says, no free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions or outlawed, blah, 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 except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. Well, no free man is broader than the nobles.
No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, but they didn't think of most of those people as free, I believe.
We'll talk a little bit about the distinction between serfs and freemen. There certainly is a distinction in the world at the time. So there are pieces. You're absolutely right that there are pieces there in Magna Carta that don't just apply to the nobles who are in charge.
And this is one of the first times, this is maybe where Magna Carta is a little bit special, is this becomes one of the first times in history where we have a codified law document written by people in power that considers someone other than just themselves. So Ralph, thank you for pointing that out. That's a good...
I'd like to ask a question.
Yes, please.
Could you talk about Article 61, the security clause, which, as I understand it, is sort of the original seat of Parliament?
So that there are going to be 25 barons whose responsibility it will be to essentially watch the king and to take over should the king fail. That's the real kicker of Magna Carta. That's the power behind it.
And that only really comes into play in the reign of Henry III. But the seeds are, like you said, the seeds are laid for that here in 1215 and later 1217. Also.
And part of the reason for that is that Magna Carta is thrown out within months of it being written, because this is where John becoming a papal fief actually pays off for him, because it is the Pope who essentially annuls the agreement between John and his barons for John. Of course, the barons are still going to, continue fighting for what they, for the issues that they're arguing over. But it gives John a clean conscience for breaking this document on his own.
Right. In 1215, John agrees to this, and then most historians will say he agrees to it to buy time, that he probably never really intended to do that. When the Pope, at this point, still Innocent III, when Innocent III hears about this, he's not happy. And just like Andrew said, he said,
and it's particularly that the superiority clause that you could have barons overseeing an anointed king.
Correct.
But an anointed king is not the same thing as a normal person.
Right. And then in Honorius III fashion, he excommunicates them, all who had signed this sort of thing. But anyway, this is the seed that eventually becomes Parliament in the reign of Henry III. And it was that's a pretty radical move. Medieval society is not often known for social justice, and I wouldn't necessarily call this social justice, but this is a fairly radical move. And there are 4 original copies that survive of Magna Carta. And this is one that you can see here from Salisbury Cathedral. We don't know who wrote them. We feel very confident, I say we, the historiography is very confident that Stephen Langdon was very much involved. And some of the moving of the needle that you get is likely to be attributed to him. We don't know that for sure. We'll probably never know that. But
the first point is protection of the church. So,
but there's a good argument to be made, right? That his voice comes through in this document a little bit as well. So moving on to John's death and the First Barons' War, John says, yes, I'll agree to Magna Carta. He just waffles and buys time, and then he says, no, I won't do it. So he starts seizing baronial lands in 1215, and there's full-blown rebellion at this point, led by Robert Fitzwalter. He's pretty powerful. He's got a lot of lands in the north. He actually has quite a bit of land as well in Essex in the south. I think I would have to double check this, but I think he actually has more land in Essex than the Earl of Essex had. Who is technically higher in the peerage than he was, but he was quite a smart cookie in the way that he married and all these other things. So he is nobody to be messed with. And so he's chosen actually by his peers to lead this rebellion. And there's a lot of guys that are with him, but the 6 big boys, so to speak, the Earl of Chester, Earl of Surrey, a few of the others are still with John. So John probably has the advantage. And after early 1216, the barons realize that. So then they start trying to play the political game rather than just the military game. And they go to France. And they are encouraging Philip II, Philip Augustus, to join with them. He says, I can't do it because the Pope will excommunicate him. Part of the treaty that got John back in good graces with the Pope also had some application to the Capetian leaders as well. Well, against his father's advice, Louis II, who is the heir apparent of France, the son of Philip Augustus, sorry, not Louis II, Louis, he joins the barons. He wants to be king in England. He wants to have that regency as well. So he he gathers an army and they start to cross the Channel. We see major sieges at Dover, at Windsor, at Rochester, a few other places, and he kind of gained an advantage early. He conquered a lot of southern England, but over time, his army kind of dissipated and he lost the advantage. And the advantage is back with John. And John could have, at Winchester particularly, John could have struck the decisive blow, but he didn't. In what historians would call kind of true John fashion, he just couldn't be decisive about, at least seemingly, it looks like from the records, he couldn't decide what he wanted to do. And so rather than striking at Winchester, he went on a campaign up the eastern coast and into the northern territories, which eventually would have been important. It's not a dummy move, but hindsight's 20/20, and looking backwards, it doesn't make a lot of sense to do that anyway. But he goes that way rather than striking the initial blow. And while he is there, he makes some gains, but has to hurry back south. And he stops in the marshes, and he is recorded as drinking new cider and eating unripe peaches. And he dies. He develops dysentery, and he dies in 1216. The chroniclers, some of them really wanted to say that he was poisoned, or that maybe he overindulged himself, and that's what led to his death. But of course, some of them really didn't like him, so they wanted to say that about him. We don't know that it's true. There's obviously no clear evidence to say that he was poisoned or that he overindulged himself. It just looks like it was something, a tragic accident that happened.
I mean, there's a long family history of dying of dysentery amongst his ancestors. So
he dies. And what we end up with is a sudden shift in power where William Marshal starts encouraging barons to abandon Louis and to join the cause of Henry III, who is John's heir apparent, but at this time is still only 9 years old. And we still don't understand completely why, but William Marshal is able to convince a lot of these guys to change tack.
I think there had been friction between Louis and the troops that he brought in, right, and some of the native leaders who were in rebellion, particularly over issues like taking over captured territories. Yes. Because the English wanted those territories to go back to their rightful owners, whereas Louis had all of his forces that he had promised lands to, so there was some tension there, and I think that was certainly a factor. And I mean, John's dead, Henry's like 9, so he could be anything. Correct. Why are we going to put, up to this point, our entire lives have been fighting against the Capetian monarchy. Why are we going to put them in control now? So I think that explains a lot of the
I would
sort of
agree,
shifting of
and
sides.
I think a lot of them also recognize we've lost the advantage, and I don't think that they wanted to continue to draw that line all the way out to its conclusion. So some of your most romantic historians will say, "Oh, it was Marshall's personality that won them over," and I'm not that naive. I don't think that that's really. That could be all that it was. Maybe that played a part. I don't know. I'm not willing. I mean,
even as a cynic, man, I can convince a 9-year-old to listen to me far better than a 25-year-old French prince. So
just a comment on the Magna Carta. I think there were a number of different editions of it. The 1215 was the original one, but then it was reissued in 1216 in a somewhat different form. For example, the security clause was deleted.
Yes, for Henry
became more voluntary, and hence more I guess that was a promise by Marshal and Henry III that, okay, here were the elements they were going to abide by, right, some of the elements they were going to throw out. Right. But that was a promise to abide by.
It's a political masterstroke, because it's like, hey, we're going to make this 9-year-old king, and look, he already agreed to that document that started this whole thing off. You've got everything you wanted except for the 25 people, with the asterisk down at the bottom. But yes, absolutely. I think that was one of the things that that helped as a tipping point for a lot of the barons who were on the edge.
And a lot of the barons were willing to give that up, clearly, because like Andrew said a second ago, Henry III could be anybody. But again, that speaks to the idea that they didn't really trust John. And a big part of their problem was John the person, not necessarily institution of monarchy. So kind of moving out of that, we had some questions. Oh, is there a question?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, now at this point, England's lands are still technically. Does John still have that agreement with the Pope on England being so my understanding is that like Philip Augustus doesn't want to support Louis because Louis going over and becoming King of France. He kind of pushes back on that. And the reason for that is because Philip doesn't want to. He just got in the Pope's good graces, and he doesn't want to offend Innocent. So can you kind of talk about that for just a second, if you?
So both John and Innocent are dead by 1216. So it's a whole new playing field. I have never heard specifically where the England breaking as a papal fief happened. I think it just fell through the cracks with a new Pope and a new king.
I would agree.
At the point, I guess what I'm talking about is at the point when the barons go to France to tell Louis, or to basically make the offer to Louis and say we swear fealty to you. Philip is there, Innocent's alive, John's alive. This is the first attempt to go over, which kind of doesn't end up happening. But at that point, Philip, is like, hey, I'm not gonna. But I guess after they die, then I guess it's a moot point. But I just didn't know if there's just a lot of interesting.
I think Philip was also
in play there.
I can't believe that Louis went to England without Philip. I can say I'm not supporting this, but son, you go off, and when we win, we'll win big. Because the same thing happens. William Marshall's son is one of the leaders in with the rebels. I mean, he's not at the level of the barons, he's under that. But one of the arguments with Louis's forces comes over whether a castle that has been won in a siege is going to go to a French knight or going to go to William Marshall the Younger. Mm-hmm. So everybody's the political players are plug family members in on the other side during this time period.
Sorry, go ahead, Andrew.
Well, I was just going to say it's the one line from Braveheart that I actually love because it's the one time there is medieval thinking in that movie. And don't get me wrong, I love it as a movie, just not as medieval history. But it's when the elder Bruce says to his son, "You will support this while I support the." I mean, that is very medieval power politics.
Yes. Also, to your point there, Jake, I don't think that Louis raises the type of forces that he has and the amount of forces that he has without the backing of the royal exchequer to some degree. So while Philip II cannot openly support it, there has to be a tacit agreement there. Otherwise, you don't end up with a legitimate threat to the physical lands in England. I don't think that's really that possible. Because yes, he's the Dauphin, he's the heir apparent, he's got a lot of sway and a lot of power, but it was pretty significant. So I think that's probably the most that I can say about that. Andrew, is there anything else you would want to add?
Just at the last two major battles of the war at Lincoln, when the siege of Lincoln is lifted, there's pretty significant capturing of some of the rebel barons. Fitzwalter is captured. The French Count of Perche is killed, which like the world stops because a count has died in battle.
Yes.
So I think that took a lot of the steam out of those that were left in England. And then shortly thereafter, there was a pretty significant sea battle, which essentially destroyed the ability of the Capetians to ship over reinforcements.
Right. That was the Battle of Sandwich.
Yes.
Excellent. So as we kind of move into economic data here, Andrew, I'll let you kind of remind us a little bit about the hierarchy of medieval society before we see more about the common man and what life was like under John.
So we often talk about medieval society as a pyramid. The king is on the top. There's lots of peasants on the bottom. In some ways, there are kind of two superimposed pyramids because you can do a second one for the church that follows sort of a similar path with, you know, parish priests on the bottom and the Pope certainly on the top. But the connections in society, there certainly are lots of legal connections, and that's growing. That was one of the big features of Henry II's kingship, was building up English law to sort of start the concept of common law as we would know it today. But a lot of the connections between these various layers are through codependency. And so if I'm a landed knight and have been granted a manor that is the source of my income, I have it in the power to tax my peasants and to make their lives as good or as poor as I wish. If they're not willing to actually work the land, though, and actually grow crops to sustain my style of life, this whole system is going to fall apart. And so I think you see a wide variety of interactions between the various levels of society, much based on personality, but they only really worked in medieval society if those pieces were working together. And there are accounts from this time period of peasants and serfs running away from bonds, but there are also examples of serfs who thought their lives superior because of the stability that it offered them and their families, as opposed to a freeman who could just be kicked out of a particular piece of land if something changed hands.
Correct.
So it's much more diverse and complicated than we often view it.
And just because someone was a serf, it didn't mean they didn't have a good quality of life. I think that's something that's important to talk about. Now, it's very difficult for us to imagine, you know, what that life was like, but you know, when stability, you had more holidays than what we have now by far. You know, the average serf, and the serf is the lowest end of the pyramid. You know, the average serf had 12 acres of the Lord's land that were technically were the Lord's, but that was in the care of the serf. That was what he used to feed his family. He could sell excess crops from that and make money. Of course, the Lord would tax that, but you know, he could, you know, there were lots of ways. He only had to work the Lord's lands, you know, maybe a little bit more during harvest time and during planting season. But outside of that, he's not working more than 1 or 2 days a week on the Lord's domain lands, the Lord's, you know, where he's growing crops to feed his manorial house and to sell for profit. So
John, here, I don't mean to be devil's advocate, but
Please
similar
do, John.
arguments were made by defenders of slavery in the American South. The slaves were better off because their owners had and felt obligations to them, while in the North, the capitalist proletariat were cast aside at every economic downturn, and that people were better. It just doesn't, I mean, the problem is that there were good owners, good aristocrats, good barons, but there were also a lot of bad ones who abused their people terribly.
You are correct. And this is,
yeah.
Andrew, let me make a quick distinction.
Please do.
I really want to be careful that we don't compare this too much to slavery, because those, I do think they're distinct things. And I'm okay with a minor comparison like what you're making here, but I want to be sure we don't get too far down that path. Slavery is a horrible evil. There's no way around it. It's terrible. There's no good in it. Okay, I 100%. That's the statement that, you know, I want to make. But I do think to some degree serfdom is a little bit different. This is not an argument about that serfdom was good for the people, or what they should have the ability to do or what not. But maybe one of the major differences, and Andrew, you can talk about some of this. Maybe one of the major differences is a lot of these serfs could leave serfdom to some degree. Now, not everybody could, but there were allowances for that.
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, I take your, so not to go too far in background, but as a historian, my area of focus for most of my career has been essentially American slavery in 19th century United States history. American slavery is a very unique form of slavery as far as the world stage is concerned. And I'm not trying to put moral values on anything that I'm saying right now. I'm trying to put historical values on them. So serfdom in its in its genesis comes from classical slavery. There's a direct connection. And as the Roman world becomes Christianized, the teachings of the Christian church become incompatible with the concepts of classical slavery. And so what happens is classical slavery morphs into what in the medieval world we call serfdom. It is different in some ways to American slavery in that it is not necessarily based on family status. It is tied to a piece of land. You are not owned by the lord of the manor. You are owned by the manor. If I buy that manor farm, my serfs don't follow me to the next manor. They stay on that piece of land, and the new person that's placed on that manor is then their overlord. Those aren't moral judgments. I'm not saying one is better than the other, but it is a very different system than American slavery. But you're right that you can make moralistic arguments that ring hollow for both cases. I don't want to tread in this conversation on the very thin ice of economic systems, because sometimes the moral judgments come with baggage. There are lots of people that think capitalism is the best moral system, and it does a lot of people very wrong. There are a lot of people that think Marxism is a great economic system, and it has done a lot of people a lot of wrong. What I can say is that the medieval economic system lasted considerably longer than either of those modern economic systems, and it seemed to work for the society for a long period of time. That doesn't mean people were maltreated, but we also know throughout history that if you maltreat people enough, they rise up against that treatment. So I think it's really hard for us with our modern eyes to look back at the medieval world. We know that in some cases there were serfs that valued their standing of serfhood because they always had a piece of land that they were attached to as part of that manor that they could live off of, that was permanently something that they were connected to. Now that means that they didn't have the freedom to move around, but the concept of moving around as a free person in world history is a very modern concept. So it's a very complicated thing to unpack. But I take the point really, really well. Yes, if you had an absolute jerk for a lord, your life was going to be terrible. You're absolutely right. But if you have an absolute jerk for a boss today, even in a capitalistic system, it's going to be terrible. And it becomes vastly different than when we start to inject things like American slavery as it become in our country and try to use it as parallels. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, I agree with you. They're very, very difficult things to compare. It's just I heard echoes of what the slavers in the South used in the 1850s to defend the system.
Please don't hear that. That's definitely not an argument that's being made here. I'm
sorry.
No, but
we live in the age of Tolkien. There's a lot of romanticism about the medieval period, and it's become a major part of our imaginations now because of Tolkien. And I think that's a good thing. He was a very great artist in many ways, but we have to be aware of the downsides. So
you're correct. Andrew, do you want to talk briefly about the differences between cottagers and boarders and serfs? And
I think we actually, in many ways, sort of covered that in what we just, branched into. So the basic difference between a freeman and a serf, considering both at a peasant class, is that a serf is tied directly to their land. It is that antecedent from classical slavery, whereas a freeman would have the right to pack up and move around. Both of those come with very different strings attached. A serf could not just be kicked off their land by a lord because they're connected to that land. It got more complicated than that. Whereas a freeman that was paying rent, you could kick that freeman, out in the cold if that was your choice, if you were the owner of that particular piece of rented land. Towns are a growing thing during this time period. The period of the end of the 12th century saw the largest growth in town areas in England from any time up until the period of the Industrial Revolution. Towns usually had rich sponsors. And what meant is there was an understanding, if you were a serf, you ran away and lived in town for a year, that you had gained your freedom. So we do know that serfs were running away. Not all of them were satisfied with their life. But as previously mentioned, there are also serfs that valued the life that they had. So kind of a mixed bag. And the same thing, certainly with cottages and borderers and freemen. And the economic scales so in modern economic thinking, when we speak of things like classes, we have jobs and lifestyles that kind of line up with each other. And that's not necessarily true of pre-industrial worlds. There were some serfs who lived very good lifestyles and some that starved and eked things out. And that was certainly true of cottagers and borderers. That was certainly true of merchants as well. Economic status and social status were not always as closely aligned as we think of in a post-industrial world, where we talk of things like lower class.
Could I make a brief comment on the merchants to go back a bit? The City of London and the merchants sided with the barons against King John.
Absolutely.
And a number of the provisions of the Magna Carta were protecting the traditional rights of the cities and the merchants. Thanks.
Yep.
Yes, you're right.
Robert Fitzwalter had connections in London as well. One of his 2 castles was in London. I'm sorry, was there another question there?
I kind of spoke up, and I just wanted to sort of reiterate a point that I think it was Andrew just made, that social class and economic status weren't as closely tied as we kind of think of them today. The whole of the feudal system is a social, I don't want to say social system, but it's a network of interlocking loyalties, I guess you could say. It has much less to do with economics than it does with how society interacts with itself. I think I've managed to make a fool of myself, but
no, not at all. You're right. It's hard because when you're looking at lords and knights, then there is a definite financial difference between somebody who is in that position, usually, and somebody who's a free peasant, a cottager, a borderer, a serf. But not in the same way that when we say things like upper class, or when we talk about a class structure today, class structures are very post-industrial and they don't fit a pre-industrial world.
Agreed.
I have a question. We mentioned the City of London and about how the merchants of the city, Ralph pointed out the merchants of the City of London sided with the barons, etc. What was the status? What was a City of London as an entity within the social system?
So towns and cities were standalone structures that were usually sponsored by somebody who was higher up in the social chain. So if you were a lord, you could sponsor a town.
Right.
Bristol, Liverpool, both of them are sponsored during this period.
What is that?
I'm sorry.
What does that mean, sponsored?
Basically, a lord says, we're going to set up a town here.
Yeah, I'll pay for it.
Because I own this land and I will pay for starting it up. And you know what? I'm even going to give you a break on taxes if you live in this town.
Right. And it usually starts from a perspective of a market. You want to grow, lords who are wealthy enough, would want to grow market centers in their territories because that draws more people in, it draws more taxable income in. That the whole idea that you found a town, the whole reason that you found a town is because people are coming together because of there's some sort of advantage to that. Sometimes it's physical protection. a lot of times it's a market-based system or scheme. So a lord would pay to found the town, and just like Andrew had said, and then that eventually grows. And some of these towns grow pretty big. At this time, London is a place where you can find people across the spectrum as a whole. You can all kinds of different, thing. You can get a lord living in his castle on the Thames, and then you can have somebody living in the gutter a mile down the street. So,
well, who sponsored London's, for example, the City of London?
London has existed, since early Roman times, if not pre-Roman times. So London existed before there was a concept of cities growing based on an economic system, even at this time period.
Was there a mayor of London?
Yes, Lord Mayor of London.
London selected?
That is an excellent question. Off the top of my head, I do not have an answer.
All right.
We'll have to look up. Zach, I have a quick question for you. We're up on our time here. You want us to go on to some conclusions and final questions, or
keep going? And then let me know where you think is the stopping point yourself. We usually don't limit ourselves to 2 hours.
I'm really bad at stopping points.
No. We enjoy it. This is really, really educational, and everybody's here is entrenched, and then some people logged in later, actually.
Great.
So,
go
ahead.
We'll forge ahead and then try to limit our commentary a little bit so that we can move through. One of the things I want to be sure that we hit really quick is the economic system, because economics, while Andrew's made an excellent point about talking about pre-industrial societies, post-industrial societies, one thing that doesn't change even between those is the fact that money does mean power in a lot of ways. And so money is something that people are after. And in England at this time period, the only form of money that you have is the English penny. That's called a pence. Okay. And you have different, values in that. So, a pence is a penny, but when you have 1 pound worth of pennies, you have a pound, which was worth 20 shillings, and there are 12 pence per shilling. So in England, you have these different variations, but the only cash is actually pennies. So if you were going to bring a pound, if you were going to spend a pound in cash, this is part of why trade and barter is still a big deal. But if I'm going to spend a pound in cash, I'm literally carrying a pound's worth of these little silver pennies around with me wherever I go. So when we read in the Chronicles that, that John had 500 pounds of currency transferred to the south of England in preparations for the French invasions of 1214, he had people literally carting money, like 500 pounds worth of money, which at this time would buy a lot of stuff. So let's talk about this for a minute. Let's look at the economic data that we have with the nobility. Remember that the nobility, if we go back to that pie chart, is like 0.01%. Okay. The total population, and to me, it's amazing how some of the historians that do this can get some of these numbers for population and for like GNI, the gross national income. But when you look at their methodologies, it's really sound. It's amazing what we're able to kind of determine from some of the stuff that we have across disciplines. And we can be fairly certain that there were about 3.9, somewhere between 3.4 and 3.9 million people living in England in the decade 1210 to 1220. The maximum amount of nobles that you have at this time is 296. There really aren't many dukes at this time, but like earls, barons, the general nobility, okay? This includes people exclusively in Ireland, in northern France, some on the edges of Scotland, that sort of thing. So they're not all on, in England proper as far as this is concerned. Some more conservative estimates will say that you really only have 160 known nobles in England in the first quarter of the 13th century. So this means out of 3.9 million people, you have a maximum of 296 people who have like 50% of the wealth, which is just insane. You have a lower ranking level of nobility, which is called the gentry. These are knights. Oftentimes they're landless knights. They are going into service for someone else. So they might go see a more powerful lord, and he grants them a fief where they then, give military service to him. Also, a money fief was becoming increasingly popular in John's reign. You didn't want to give away land because crops and food had become so expensive. A lord could make more money by keeping as much land under his own control as he could. So he might just pay a knight a money fief, where the knight does have lodging or lives on his land, and he is there to provide military service and to help administer the running of the estate. Because some of these lords, even your mid-level lords, just an average noble has an estate somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 acres, which is a lot of land, and you have to manage it all. And so you do need a relatively robust system of management in order to get out of that what you want to. So that system does exist. The gross national income of England in this time period is estimated at about £7 million per year. The king and the nobility were worth 50% of that gross national income every year. And the average noble earned somewhere around 200 times what the average peasant earned each year. The average peasant earned somewhere around £4 a year. So the average noble, a lord or baron of some kind, is around £800. Some people will argue less. There's a prominent scholar, Christopher Dyer, who will argue less. He'll argue somewhere around £200 to £300. But the work that he argues that in was from the early 80s, and there's been a lot more work done since then. So if you do read Dyer's stuff, he's got a lot of great arguments, but do read that one with a grain of salt, because there's just been more discovery since he wrote that, wrote that stuff 30 years ago or more, almost 40 years ago. Yes.
Question. To what extent was this really a money economy? To what extent did people just basically subsist off of the growth of their land? They have shelter, so that even though we say, well, they have 50% of the income, well, people weren't paid a salary, right? Most people were living off a proportion of what they grew.
Some people were paid a salary.
Some were.
Yes, some were. Most were not, unless outside of the military sphere and some of the administrative sphere. Most of them were not paid a salary.
But one of the things that England does that allows so much of its early growth is they're building into the sort of Anglo-Saxon bureaucracy that pre-exists when the Normans arrive. And because there is a new ruling class that's coming into this old bureaucracy, everything gets dialed into money as a way of valuing things that exist. And so if you look at the Doomsday Book, for example, which is, as a result of William the Conqueror taking over England, they're putting monetary values on pieces of land in the Doomsday Book simply as a way of accounting for, okay, we just want ourselves a country. What exactly do we have here?
Yep. What's it worth? What can I charge these people for it in terms of service? I think, Paul, to answer your question, I think it's increasingly becoming a money economy, especially under John. There's a lot of evidence to show that, because John increases the amount of mints. He increases the purity of silver that's being put into the pound. John's investing quite a bit in a monetary system. Part of that is because of his love for mercenaries, and mercenaries are paid in cash. Sometimes they're paid in other things, but mostly they're paid in cash. And that's even from the primary records of the time. Most of them would prefer cash up front. So to some degree, for your common man, there's not a ton that's going to be in monetary economy. There's going to be some, but not a ton. He's going to know what money is. He's going to have seen money. He's going to have held money and probably used it to some degree. But as far as a money economy goes, it's not there yet. It's growing. It's growing significantly under John, and your nobles are all dealing in money. They are still bartering and trading some things, but they are absolutely dealing in money on a regular basis. Andrew, would you disagree?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, it probably was largely a barter economy on the ground,
right?
But certainly in record keeping, the concept of a monetary value for a good certainly existed.
It was there, yes.
So I think there was certainly your average community is living off of the things they grow, whether they do it individually or oftentimes as a community and have, sort of a community larder. But they would have understood kind of the what the going rate for a monetary value was.
They know what the value is. The way that your nobles are making money, the primary way they're making money is rents on structure and on land. So again, under John, we've got this move, and really kind of started to the end of Henry II's reign, but you got this move to stop having so many knights and land fief that are on your land, and you're trying to bring more of that land back into your own domain so that you can make more money off of it. You're also making money from produce, excess produce that you sell off your lands. You charge pasturage fees, forest rights. If you're lucky enough to own some forests, you can charge the rights. And then mills. Mills are actually a decent source of income.
And we didn't even get into the issues of forest rights with Magna Carta, and that's a whole nother.
Yes, a whole nother charter goes out in 1217 for forest rights. One thing I think that's often missed is that the cost of living could be high for the nobility. It doesn't have to be, but it is. And I don't think that a lot of people take enough time to look at that. And I'm going to show you some numbers in a second, but food costs for a household were enormously expensive. And as a baron, as a lord, you have to have a household that you maintain. That's expected of you. And you also have to have it to even maintain the enterprise as a whole. Construction or upkeep on a manorial seat can be expensive, but not always. That's not something that's a fixed cost by any means, or a standard cost. You are required by law to provide military equipments to your household knights or sergeants. Those people that are working for you in any kind of military or administrative capacity. You're paying them a salary. You're also paying for their equipment in a lot of ways. You have to provide them at least a minimum amount of equipment. You are often providing meals for manorial staff, your household, the people that work within your manor itself, the actual house. You're providing meals for those people every day. So your household people are eating from your table constantly. And then everybody that works on your manor, you're providing meals for some of them, at the very least, for special holidays. Some people would even argue that you're providing that more regularly, even down to a few times a week. Andrew, do you have any specific info you want to share on that?
Yeah, there's in terms of lifestyle, particularly for the nobility, you're starting to see the shift from the hall to the apartment. We're still in the period of the hall sort of ruling the household, as opposed to apartments. And that's where you start to see the shift between communal meals for your entire household to the Lord eats over here and everybody else eats somewhere else, and never the twain shall meet. That doesn't mean if you were, the lowliest shepherd at the manor house, that you were getting the choice dishes first at the in the hall from the table. But the concept is that you essentially provided one meal for your entire household in your hall, and that was expected for all of those that lived in that building. And to be fair, you had hired the cooks and the staff that cooked that food, and so it was interconnected. It wasn't just I'm buying a meal for these people. These people all have various jobs on this piece of land.
Right. One of the things that I thought was really interesting in looking up some info on this, there's an account of a Somerset shepherd who he was paid a wage, and this is one of the things, he was paid a wage. And one of the things that was included in his contract is that every year on Christmas Eve, he was to get a loaf of bread, an entire loaf to himself or for his family, and a dish of meat. And then on Christmas, his dog, which tells you about that's still an important tool of the trade at this time, his dog is entitled to a loaf of bread on Christmas Day. And this was required to be provided. And if it wasn't, he could go to his lord and complain, and the lord could say no. But this is kind of codified in some ways. It's written as part of what he's supposed to receive. And so you get little bits and pieces of this, which kind of give you a glimpse.
And and stuff like that was increasingly part of the job of what knights did.
Correct.
There's a reason that we call lawyers esquire today. There's a direct connection starting in England between knighthood and legal duties, not just military duties.
Correct. Sadly, there are not really a lot of household records that survive from our time. But what I was able to do was go. I took several examples of household expenditures over about a 100-year period. And one of the things that was very interesting to me is even though the actual costs change, the percentages never varied by more than 1 or 2% for the cost to run a household, a composite budget for what a household is looking at every year. So looking at this chart, if you assume £1,000 for your annual budget for an average baron, this is just your mid-level guy. He's nobody fancy. He's nobody super important, but he's important in the community that he's in. He's spending over half of his yearly income on food. And that's not just him having the choicest dishes. This is him providing a lot of food. So he's got to grow all that food. And it's very interesting that we have, again, this interdependence. He has to grow a lot of food, partially because he's trying to make money off of that, but also because he's got responsibility to a lot of people. He's got to feed them. He's got to ensure that he's doing his nightly duty. So 55% of his income every year on average is spent on food costs for his household. His household wages, this is the people, the household knights, the sergeants, any folks that he's employing to be kind of in his house or to travel with him as part of his administration. He's got to have these people to maintain the huge enterprise that he's got going. And when I say huge, I literally mean physically huge. 3,000 to 5,000 acres is a lot of land. So he's paying these people a salary. They're getting wages. They're also getting food from his table. They're getting equipment from him. If you're living in the medieval period, this is actually probably the sweet spot. You don't have the same responsibilities that are required legally by being a lord. You also get a good wage. You're paid to do what you do every day. Your food's provided, all this good stuff. A lord is going to show his wealth off. And I was amazed at how much people were spending on clothing. He's spending 10% of his budget. I don't know how many of you out there spend 10% of your money every year on clothes. I surely don't. Maybe there's some that do, but I definitely don't. But these guys were doing it all the time, because when you're going to the royal court, or where you're going to the Earl's court, when you're going and representing yourself and your cause and giving reports to your overlords, you're expected to dress the dress. Much like today, if you're going to an important meeting, you don't wear sweatpants. You're going to wear a suit and tie, or a nice ensemble, whatever it is. So they're kind of in the same boat. Agricultural expenses are about 7%. This is seed. This is, costs for the plowman. This is anything that it takes to kind of prep the land and buy the supplies that are needed to grow the crop. Your household supplies are at 6%. This includes things like wax for candles, wood for fuel in the fireplace, all that kind of stuff. Horses are a big deal if you're a knight, especially in this period. They're still a major deal. And about somewhere between 5 and 7% of your annual income is going to either buying horses or maintaining the horses that you have. It doesn't show up in every budget, but capital improvements like adding a section onto your house, or building some new barns, that sort of stuff is coming out as well. And then miscellaneous costs for small things is about 2%. So if you're spending 100% of your budget every year, £1,000, that's how you spend it on average. And you can kind of see the graph that's down here that gives you a picture of how much it is. And again, just looking at food, you see the enormous cost of food. Everything else combined doesn't even equal food. I mean, it's just an incredible expense. Part of that is a little bit of John in this time period. Part of that is just food became expensive and stayed expensive for a while. When we're looking at food, our biggest expenditure, 48% of that money is going to meat or fish. And this is, again, feeding the Lord and feeding other people in his household. Everybody didn't get meat, but some people did. If you were in his favor, if he was really counting on you to do good business, he's going to treat you to some meat from time to time. Even if you're a jerk, it does well to keep people that can make or break you. It does well to keep them happy from time to time. Bread was a huge staple, which also, though, goes to show you by this percentage cost, bread and cereal grains were the least expensive food item, which they're the most thing grown, so they're the most saturated element in the market. But also, a lot of historians will point to the fact and say that a lot of the people in power recognize that this is what everybody's eating. Even the poorest of the poor are eating this. And there are records of there's actually a lot of records of town markets that subsidize grain costs. if there was a particularly bad harvest. There are records in Gloucestershire and in Norfolk and in Northumbria where local lords took a major loss and subsidized the cost of bread so that their people could eat. Didn't happen everywhere, didn't happen all the time, but there are records that it did happen. And so to some degree, there was a market fluctuation that was subsidized, at least as far as bread is concerned. Ale and wine are big expenditures as far as that goes. Some people will say it wasn't safe to drink the water. I don't know. Maybe that depends on where you are. I think it's more likely that a weaker alcohol was a great way to get calories.
Yep.
And was a way
You can almost lump that ale in with the bread as your carbohydrates. I mean, if the water was always bad and nobody could drink the water, then why were the first things prepared at a castle or a town site the well?
Exactly. So I tend to be of the belief that particularly ale was considered a source of calorie intake. And of course,
and
not
fun.
in every case. Do what?
And fun.
And fun, yes.
I mean,
and this is, in many cases, it probably is a weaker alcohol, but we don't know for sure. Pottage corn is this, basic.
There's within 50 years, we've got written descriptions of essentially you've got your first brew and your second brew from the same mash. And the first is like the table, and then the second is your small beer for, breakfast and other
Exactly.
meals.
Yeah, being around the fire on a cold night, that sort of thing. Pottage corn are your less popular grains, things like, maybe things like rye or barley, or not as popular, but less high end. Wheat makes the best bread. And some of this could also, if you were wealthy enough, some of this could also go to some of your animals. Spices, had a cost. Dairy had a cost. Fruit, vegetables, cider, small things, and these are all from the budgets of households. So this is what people were buying. And over 100-year period, this is I think it's pretty remarkable that we have those records and we can look and see what they had. What does an early 13th century lord and his household look like? Andrew and I know each other because we do reenactment together. Public education is something that's really important for us. It's something that we really take seriously. And this is what it looks like. This is what the Lord of the Manor looks like. He's dressed in his finery, and he presides over his court. And he, in some ways, not everybody, but he does have responsibility to the people. When he's called to war, here's what his household dress is like. You've got a couple of retainers. You've got a knight who's legally has some administration to help him out. You have a sergeant who helps administratively and also helps with all kinds of other tasks. These guys are probably also his personal guard when he travels about, because he doesn't want to get more than a day's ride away from home if he doesn't have to. And when you go out, you want to be protected. You don't know what the road holds. You can see some guys here in white garments called gambesons. These are levy troops. These are your freemen, your carpenters, your foresters, your tradesmen, your masons, your miners, guys like that who are a little bit more well off than your average serf. And when you need infantry, you call for these guys. You see some kids, you see some ladies that are involved as well. I've got a slide here on women in just a second that I'll get to. But it's very much a family affair in the Middle Ages. You grew up with people. You used the people that you knew, and you tried to support one another. What does it look like for the peasantry? Serfs are bound to the land. They're almost exclusively farmers or farm workers, and they are the bottom of the economic system. One thing I do, we kind of talked about this earlier, but I do think it's important to say that their lives are not devoid of meaning. Mm-hmm. I think that's important. Some of them, when you read Piers Plowman, it sounds really dark and really bad. And it was in the early 14th century. It was bad. At this time period, things seem to be a little bit better for most people in the strata of society. But something, many of these people would say their life has meaning. Their lives were not expendable. I think that's something else that's important to mention. We know, I mentioned earlier that every serf had 12 acres of land for his family's provision. We know that because it's included in the writ of Cuxham, a barony in Oxfordshire, that every serf was entitled to this. And he could protest to his lord or to his lord's overlord if he was denied this. So there is some sort of legal recourse that goes on there. Peasants, when we hear the term peasant thrown around, typically that refers to freemen, men who are not serfs. They are men of trade rather than a man that's tied to the land. And you have even a hierarchy within this set of people. Andrew mentioned earlier there are several hierarchies, and that's true. You have somebody that's a simple laborer that makes 2 pence a day, which is hardly anything. And then you have somebody that it's a master craftsman that could end up being fairly wealthy and well-to-do on his own, or with his family. Everybody wasn't just desperately poor. What was the average peasant income? The average peasant for freemen, the average income was around £4 a year. Okay, this is numerically equivalent to about a $40,000 average salary in the U.S. today. Now, I want to be very clear that purchasing power and buying power, that's much more difficult to determine. We'll try to look at some of that in just a second. But numerically, this is about what it looks like, okay? Serf income is probably going to be lower, but we don't know exactly what it looks like because there's just no data. People weren't writing a lot about serfs unless there was some, incredible circumstances that were going on.
About the only way that you could figure out serf value is to value it as part of the manor as a whole, because it's a shared community within that manor, and that's where the inequities between your good lords or your bad lords really start to be felt more.
There's not often, especially in the 13th century, there's not sufficient data to be able to tease enough of that out. And in a lot of ways, after the Black Death, serfdom doesn't disappear, but it is drastically less.
It loses a lot of teeth.
Major societal change. Everything changes. When we're talking about freemen and employment, just like today, there are 2 basic categories. You have your permanent employees. These are people who are hired for a job that was always required. A lord, if he has forests, is going to hire a forester, for example. Somebody that manages that forest land for him, both legally, and then also he's scouting. He's determining where's good lumber, what areas of this forest is wildlife present, where areas are not. How do I manage that? How do I try to make that better for the Lord? That's his job. Some folks had a doctor. We know for a fact that doctors were big in Italy. They were becoming big in France. They were also a thing in England. John had more than one. He had doctors, he had surgeons, he had all kinds of different degrees of medical folk that were around, and that's a permanent position. Then you have your temporary folks, somebody who's hired by the job. And today, many of our folks that we say, like literally the term is contractor. They come in for a contract. You have an electrician that comes in and does a job, and when that job is over, he moves to the next job. Much like that in the Middle Ages, somebody like a thatcher, who is somebody who did roofs, the straw roof that you see on many English traditional houses. They come in and they work by the job. So these are people who are temporary and hired for contract work. What would the average income look like? A lot of this data comes from various sources. The most helpful source I found is a guy, Dr. Gregory Clark. He's an economic historian out of the University of California. And he is brilliant in the kind of work that he's done with other people across different disciplines, has produced some really amazing stuff. And one of the things that we can see, he's pulled out a lot of that. And some of this also comes from the pipe rolls. In John's reign, like we said at the very beginning, he really was able to kind of bring out more record keeping. And some of that we have trickling down to barons who start to keep better records of their books. And we know what people were paid. We know that a master carpenter on average was making 6 pence a day, which works out to somewhere between £7 12 shillings and £9 2 shillings. That's almost twice. On the high end, it is twice what your average peasant was making every day. Was he permanent or was he temporary? It depends. If he's working for the Lord and the Lord is expanding his buildings significantly, he might work there for years and really become a kind of a permanent employee as opposed to somebody that's a contract employee. Looking down the list, you can see some other things. A stone cutter, probably somebody that's mostly temporary unless you've got some major castle or wall building going on. And then in that case, you might hire a smaller amount to do the work. You might hire a larger amount to get it done more quickly. So it's still a contract job. You don't know. We don't have a lot of those records. We have some, but not a lot. And you can kind of see what folks are making. Down at the bottom of the list, you have a vintner, somebody who's taking care of, I would assume this person would have been paid much higher. This is somebody taking care of the Lord's, the Lord's grapevines, what's eventually going to become.
It's also England.
But it's also England, who are, yeah. the French,
England was not known for good wine.
yeah, the French notoriously deride them. They make fun of them because they say the English knights don't know the difference between good wine and poor wine. I've read that I don't know how many times in different accounts. So apparently it was a common insult thrown at the English.
It's even thrown at John. He was visiting Philip Augustus at one point, and supposedly, you know, the joke was said that John only drank all the borscht wines that were in the house he was staying in.
That's what he preferred, right? So your vintner, even though they're a freeman, they're at the low end of the status. You know, they're low end. They're making £1 5 shillings, which is equivalent to about $10,000 to $12,000 a year. I mean, that's not much, and that's a permanent employee. Now, of course, there may be other perks and things that come along with this job that we don't know about that help sustain this person. His housing was probably provided by the Lord, a few other things. But he couldn't expect to make as much money as, say, a tailor or a master miner or a forester, somebody like that could. So let's kind of look at a chart here that tells us a little bit about this. You can see some annual wage comparisons that I put together to help us kind of visualize this. And your average peasant income at about £4 a year is in blue. And you can see the different jobs in orange, how they kind of pan out. Whether they're on the low end, the medium end, or over the high end on the right. And you can kind of see once you get over to your military professions here on the right, they're making significantly more than what your average thatcher or stonecutter is making. They're living at a really, really comfortable rate, actually, in a lot of ways. So comparing these professions to the Lord, I first made a chart, and the disparity was so big you couldn't even see the guys over on the left hand side. So this is a profession versus 10% of the Lord's income. So the Lord at 10% of his annual income, you can see him compared to some of these professions here. And then when we move down to the other chart, you can actually see this grand disparity of wealth. So even the knight who is making the most money out of anybody in the household is not even close. He can't touch the Lord's income. So what did things cost? We were talking about the common people and how how they were living, and you can kind of see a chart here. And this is a chart that comes from Clark's work, and he can tell you that for 4.2 pence. Okay. So that is 4.2 pence. That's a day's wage. You can buy 64 pounds of grain for 1 day's work. Even a large family is not going to eat 64 pounds. Now, of course, you don't come out with 64 pounds of bread by any means, but a large family can subsist on that for a decent amount of time. Again, this kind of points to the idea that things were tenable for the average freeman that's out there working. This is tenable. Meat is more expensive. I'm sorry.
A pound of bread a day is about right for, basic consumption.
Sure.
If you're living off of bread as staple grains.
Right. More than just a subsistence hand to mouth. This is you're going to bed not crying from an empty stomach. So bread is affordable. Meat at 5.9 pence, so roughly 6 pence for a pound. It's more than the cost of bread. And look at that, 1 pound to 64 pounds. That tells you how expensive meat was. But you can kind of see a percentage here of how things played out. Your average freeman they're buying beer and cider. We know this. We know that they have to buy clothing. Tailors were a popular profession. Some people were maybe making their own clothes, but they probably weren't unless you were a tailor, because you didn't just go out and buy cloth. Cloth had to be grown from linen flax or cut from sheep in the form of wool, and it had to be dyed, and it had to be, there's a whole process that goes into this.
Probably a lot of undergarment, like shirts and shifts and things like that, would have been produced at home. Most homes would have had a bit of flax to make their own linen, but that's not going to be your exterior clothing.
Right. Which even for the peasant class, they want to look good, but even then they also have to be protected from the elements at work. England is not an easy climate for most of the year, especially at this time period. They're buying things like candles. They're buying fuel for the fire at home. Fireplaces are just kind of coming into being at this time period in the first quarter of the 13th century, and only in your most noble households, because fireplaces are actually a pretty inefficient way to heat a room. Most of your folks just have a fire hearth in the center of the room, and that's what they're burning, because it's more efficient use of heat. So wood you definitely need for the fire. You're even though you have a house, and you're taking care of it, the Lord does charge you rent or a tax. Same kind of thing. There's a property tax that's on it. The Lord technically owns it, but there's a lot of records saying that folks could add on or change their house to however they wanted.
Well, and that's one of your fundamental differences between a serf and a peasant too. Is a peasant is going to be paying rent, and in many cases, serfs would not.
Correct, because their house is provided. Other general items. So you can see. Just buying the basics on an average salary, I think I have up here about 3 pence per year. You're spending 81% of your annual income on just the basics. You're probably spending a lot more than this every year because you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know if the harvest is going to fail. You don't know if the business deal that you're going into is going to pan out or not. So you need to have that money in reserve for hard times, but it doesn't take every single bit of everything you have just to live every single year. Some years it will take that and more, but it's not that way every single year. So what about the military? This is the other kind of side of things, where you have your professional employees, and you have people who are of the peasant class or of the freeman class, but they're able to kind of make some money and move up in the world a little bit because they're willing to be professional soldiers. Just like your average peasants, you've got permanent employees, and you've got temporary employees. Your household troops in your lord's house are permanent members of his household. They always have a job with him. It could be as personal guard. It could be helping him handle his business. A lot of times it's a mix of a lot of things. You end up with, like we talked about earlier, knights in fee. They're permanent members of the Lord's land, but the Lord pays them a salary instead of giving them land to farm. And then you have mercenaries, which of course are your temporary hired forces. You have knights that are heavy cavalry. They're the shock troops. And Andrew, you know a lot in this area. Can you kind of tell us a little bit about some of the knights that we're looking at here? And I'll take us to a picture. Yeah,
simply put, the defining feature of a knight is that they fight on horseback. And that is certainly true of this time period. And very specific types of horses as well. So the idea was a heavily armored warrior on horseback using particularly, spears and lances are the weapons of war of this time period. Things like swords are sidearms, are secondary weapons in comparison. Just, in terms of the perspective on military service, we know the whole reason for having a knightly class is so that the person in that role is not doing their own farming and has the freedom to do the training required to be successful. So I think there's been a lot of scholarship recently that's tried to sort of put to bed the, knights were reckless warriors who did not cooperate and work well together on the battlefield. The evidence seems to be pretty solid that they organized themselves into groups. By various terms in bases of 20 or 100, depending on the culture, that they were well enough versed to be able to do things like feign flight or work in waves. I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, but simply put, one person by themselves on horseback is not going to be an effective military tool. There are lots of vulnerabilities to horses that can be exploited. Now, if you get 100 people on horseback altogether, that is a whole nother proposition. And so the flexibility and working together was very much a key part of that.
Right, it becomes a big deal. And the reason we're going into the military side of things is because you don't get the everyday life, the economic side of this without the military side. And that's
really where feudalism comes into play. So feudalism is what happens when a Roman Empire falls and there's no longer a professional military to defend people, and society has to reorganize itself to be able to provide a military. And when the tip of the spear, figuratively and literally, is an armored person on horseback, then society needs to organize itself in a way to put those soldiers into the field.
Correct. So it's, again, this delicate balancing act, and you can't understand one without the context of the other. They are codependent on each other, and they make a difference. You also have what the sources will call sergeants. Sergeants can be two different things. They can be like cavalry, and they kind of harass the enemy. They try to encourage them to break ranks. They try to sow discord in enemy foot troops and make way for the nightly charge to break the infantry line. You also have sergeants who functioned as heavy infantry. In a lot of sources of this period of time, any heavy infantry that you have that's decently well equipped or trained sometimes gets lumped in with the word sergeant. So a lot of the accounts of the Battle of Bouvines, for example, William Le Breton's account, he talks about sergeants, and sometimes he means sergeants, sometimes he means mercenary soldiers that were professional infantry, professional foot soldiers, but he calls them sergeants. And your heavy infantry, they're meant to kind of provide this safe harbor or this safe haven for your knights. Andrew, tell us a little bit about horses and how they work on the battlefield. Can they just run continuously? What do they need to work?
So horses, and the military term for it that is used at the time and later is horses can get blown. That is, when your horse gets tired, it is no longer going to respond effectively to your actions. So if you've ever watched like good high level dressage horse riding, which are like horse competitions where they can essentially make the horse dance, and they are adjusting the lead of the horse and how the horse bends through their back just through use of rein, seat, and leg. That is a descendant of the military training that would have been used by knights. It is very far removed from our American Western view of riding, which is based on, I've got to move cattle over long distance without hurting my horse. So it's two very different styles of riding. And if you're going to have a horse carry somebody wearing armor and effectively carry them in battle, that horse has to actually work very, very hard in terms of being fit and effective. Just like a sprinter engages their abs and is working through their muscle, your horse is doing the same thing. So you get really short bursts of action, and then you need time to pull back, let the horses rest before you do your next piece. And even the equipment, lances are disposable. They're essentially a one-shot weapon.
One and done.
You go in your charge, you break your lance into an opponent, and then you come out and somebody gives you another lance.
In our group, we like to use the kind of the joke that knights are a one-trick pony. And in a lot of ways, they're good for one thing at the very beginning, that charge, try to break that infantry line, but they can't be stuck out there alone forever. So knights are important. We think they're important. We see they're important. We know they're important. A lot of the accounts are written about them, but any eyewitness military account that you read from this period talks tremendously about the coordination between knights and infantry. And infantry are less likely to be your professionals, but professional infantry, when used, really could make a difference and turn the tide of battle. We talked earlier about Philip II being unhorsed at the Battle of Bouvines, and it was Brabanters, the Brabançon infantry from Belgium or Flanders at the time, 700 of them in a core unit that literally steamrolled the French knights and the French infantry, got to the king, unhorsed him, and if it had not been for his personal bodyguard of knights and a couple of sergeants, he would have been dead on the battlefield.
And somebody gave him a replacement horse to get him out of there, essentially.
Exactly. They ate his lunch. And so to some degree, when you have, you need to have infantry, number one, so that the knights can do their job well. Also, when you have infantry that work well together, it really changes things. And we're kind of just before, we're still in that high age of knightly warfare, just before the end of the 13th century, where you start to see what historians call the infantry revolution. So that's something I think that's pretty interesting. Here's some knights. A sergeant, let's look at sergeants for a minute. They're a little bit less equipped than what you might see or hope to see in a knight. And that's because they make less money. You know, they don't have the same resources, but they're still going to be much more heavily equipped than your average infantryman who's levied from your peasant class, who's coming to fulfill his duty. A sergeant is still a professional soldier. He still has good equipment, and he is a professional combatant. Reading the accounts at Bouvines, I keep coming back to that because that's in 1214. That's right in this time period with John.
And it's just shockingly well documented.
Oh, it is.
So it's a really good. Unfortunately, a lot of the open fighting during the Barons' War or Magna Carta War, whichever name you choose, is not as well documented.
Right. But you look at Bouvines and you read accounts where you see knights coming back to their group of infantry to breathe, to rest. They take their helmet off so they can breathe for a minute.
That's that is a real thing.
Yes, it is. So, Andrew, yeah, you have a lot more experience there than what I would have. But you also read accounts of knights coming back, coming back with barely escaping with their life at the hands of sergeants or at the hands of infantry. So sergeants are professional soldiers, and if you don't respect them, they're going to eat your lunch. Okay, they're going to take you down. So looking at troop pay rates, this is how the sergeant can afford some of their equipment. Some of it's provided by the Lord if this person is a member of the household, but he's also getting paid a wage to work for the Lord. So he gets to double dip a little bit. Other professions can do the same, but this is one, that really can do that. Your Lord of the Manor, you can see, is with an average income of 1,000, 1,200 pounds a year, is making 3.4 million times what your average peasant troop is making down here at the bottom at 2 pence per day or £3 a year. Your sergeant on foot gets paid less than your sergeant on horse, although oftentimes you have a sergeant who starts the battle on horse and ends the battle on foot. It could be that his horse is a casualty of the battle. That's a regular thing that happens. It could be that his horse is tired and now he's been put into the line with the infantry, and he is strengthening that infantry line to help hold the line, to help protect, to help protect the forces that are behind, and to harass the enemy as they're moving forward to support the knights. So you can kind of see some pay rates here. Your knight is getting paid 36.5 pounds a year. They get paid 24 pence a day. That's a good rate. It's a very good rate. Your sergeant who has horses is paid half that. So they're not expected to do the same amount. They don't have the same amount of equipment, the same amount of training. But a sergeant who's been on the battlefield for a long time, a knight who's been on the battlefield for a long time, you don't want to see a combatant across from you that is showing flecks of gray, because they don't get to be that age and do this profession by accident. That is probably certain doom for you. So where
it gets really sticky with all this is there were lots of people who were knights who were not really battlefield serving knights. There were lots of people that had that title based off of, and were certainly trained in their youth, but had moved on from serving as a soldier in that particular role, although they could still be called on for service.
Correct.
But
more into administrative purposes.
Yes. Yeah.
With barons and households. A sergeant here, you can see maybe the difference with the knight. You have an open helm. You don't have quite as much mail. You can see I have 3/4 length sleeves on here. And I don't have any leg protection on, where the knights of this time would have. I also don't, it's plausible I could have, a male collar is called a coif. It covers your neck and part of your chest and up over your head. It's plausible, but not always shown in manuscript depiction. And a sergeant on foot may be carrying a spear, maybe has a sword for a sidearm, but they're trained in all kinds of different weapons. And as you see here, I have a great axe that is mentioned in the accounts at Bouvines.
Isn't it by nature, if you're going to be a foot soldier, that you couldn't really have anything approaching the armor of a mounted soldier?
So I can speak to some of the practicality. So the mounted picture was me on my horse Red.
Go look.
I finally have my mail dialed in to fit my body personally my body well. Now I can certainly move faster and easier without mail on my body. It's about 45 pounds all told, just for the body protection.
Yes.
But I have not found when wearing it fully, now that I've got it to fit my body, I don't notice it preventing me from doing things that I need to do. I can easily mount a 17-hand horse from the ground with male leggings on without worrying about it.
So your whole kit here, Andrew, is about 40 to 45 pounds, right?
Now in that picture, I got to admit I'm cheating. I don't have the hauberk on.
Okay.
But if I had the hauberk on, that's just my gambeson. It's just so dirty.
If you did, it's around 40 to 45 pounds. Correct?
So if you flip to the other picture with Sam and I, so that's 45 pounds in the male plus sword and shield and helmet.
And you can see how well that tailors to his arm and fits. And it's to provide protection without taking too much away in terms of agility and movement. There's a trade-off for sure. But the average U.S. soldier now carries a 60-pound pack. It's all in the pack, all on his or her back. This is less weight, and it's spread out over the whole body. One thing I want to draw attention to here is you see this thin belt across the waist. That helps to take some of that weight off of the shoulders and direct it to the hips, putting it down into the ground. So it's actually quite an efficient way to manage weight and to provide protection without sacrificing too much agility.
As far as protection against a cut, you cannot cut through mail.
Correct.
You just, I mean, you can, the impact force of a sword blow can be felt. Although some of that is balanced by the layers of clothing worn underneath of it. If you get involved in historians of arms and armor, they will battle like you wouldn't believe over whether padded layers were worn under armor at this time period or not. Everybody has their own opinions. There's very little documentation one way or the other. But one of the things, what's that?
I found some great documentation recently, I'll say.
Okay, I'm fairly convinced that they were wearing.
I'm in the padded camp.
Yeah, padding under mail. I agree with you, but I just wanted to be honest and say there is a lot of dispute out there. But even without padding, if you think of, if you've ever beaten a rug, which I know is a skill set a lot of people don't have anymore, but if you've ever beaten a rug, if you swing a stick to beat the dust out of that rug with everything you are worth to hit it, you're going to get a lot of resistance, even though it's just a piece of fabric. Whereas if you were to just sort of push it with a stick or your finger, it's going to bend a lot more. And mail does the exact same thing. When you hit with a very hard blow, it provides resistance to that blow. It's a very effective form of armor. It's not as effective as full, well-fitted plate, but it certainly did the job for a very long period of history.
Right. And Paul, your question, something you can see here, you can see the full helmet that's worn. That's something that's mostly worn on horseback. It's not very efficient for foot combat at all. You can't see as well. You can't hear as well. It's hard to breathe. And you can see next to him, this is a member of our company named Sam. Sam has Sam has an open face helmet on.
Yeah.
It's easier for him to breathe. It's easier for him to see what's going on. And that is important in the battle. And Paul, your question was about affordability of
no, it was about load.
Okay, about load. Okay.
So I have an anecdote on the weight of mail, because after I got back from the event where we took these pictures, I'd been wearing the mail at the event. Side note, Andrew's wearing a gambeson under his mail in that photo. I am not. I am in the camp of sometimes it was worn and sometimes it wasn't, and it probably depended on the individual knight's preference. But in that, I'm wearing about 45 pounds of mail. It's not bad. It's tiring. It's very tiring, especially since I'm not in very good shape right now. But it's not bad. You don't really notice the weight while it's on you. You notice when you take it off.
Mm-hmm.
I'll agree.
When I got back, I decided, let's see what happens. And I stuffed those 45 pounds of mail in a backpack, put that on my shoulders, and went for a walk. That was nearly intolerable.
The goal being, or the great part being, that the weight is evenly distributed.
Right.
And Paul, also to your question, professional soldiers like this are training in this stuff all the time.
Right, right.
And so it becomes a second skin. It becomes something that you're used to after a while. I'll attest, I've worn mine enough to where after a while, I don't notice it.
Question for you about that. Did your experience as reenactors in any way change your view of how these things worked, or historical things that you thought you knew that you changed your view on when you found whether it was really practical to do it? I mean, for example, I know that people who do hoplite reenactment basically have written papers saying that only an underhand thrust is possible, that the overhand thrust that's depicted in pottery, for example, is really impossible in a phalanx. And that's from their reenacting experience.
So I come at a different angle. If something seems to be true in historic sources and the equipment is not letting me do it, there's something wrong with my equipment. And the example that I can give to that, especially at this point, most of my energy doing the knight thing is focused on the equestrian side, on the horse side. We know a gentleman who has done medieval reenacting in England for much of his life and is very high up in that world. And in one discussion, he mentioned that you needed to watch out if you trotted your horse in mail because it would beat up your shoulders. Well, as an equestrian, trot is the working gait of a horse. I mean, that's how your horse, that's the most efficient gait for your horse for moving over significant pieces of ground at speed. If your equipment is not letting you do that on your horse, then either the skill level is wrong. There's a method of riding that's going to be less work on your shoulders. And that's probably true, because sitting a trot on horseback is hard to really do well. Or your armor isn't fitting and that's why it's beating up your shoulders. So I kind of take an opposite tack. If historic imagery shows that knights are fighting with, using as a ward, having their shield and their sword over their head, if my armor prevents me from doing that, there's something wrong with my armor. And that's a fit issue. And that's something I don't understand that they understood at the time.
Oh, I think I tend to typically agree with that, but I will say that my experience as a reenactor has changed my understanding of things. I won't say it's changed my belief about a lot of things, but it has absolutely informed my understanding of how mechanics work. For example, if you're going to wear padding under mail, you can see the shirt that I have on here, it's padded. It's only 3 layers of linen. So it's very lightly padded, because something that's too padded is not going to allow you to move in the way that you need to move. So padding is possible, but it needs to be correct. Also, my understanding of simple things like a belt. I could not do what I need to do in that mail if I did not have that belt on. Something as simple as a belt makes a huge difference in the way that your equipment works. So I think I would agree with Andrew, but I think I can answer your question yes in another way, that my understanding of maybe why things were done or how they were done has definitely changed based on my experience as a reenactor. Moving into kind of the levy troops, who are your not professional guys, they're paid at 2 pence per day. So even though they're coming to serve their 40 days of service, they still get paid. So when they leave their profession, or they leave their farm, or they leave whatever it is they're doing, they're still getting income. And that's a big deal. That's an important part of this. Oftentimes they have a reputation as being just pure fodder. That's all they are. They're just fodder on the battlefield. They're poorly equipped. They're an unruly rabble. They don't have any training. They're likely to flee the field. That's probably true in some cases. I don't think you can make an argument that would say that never happened. That's that's a poor thing to say or believe. But I don't think it was that way always. They're definitely going to be less equipped than your professionals, but they're not necessarily going to be poorly equipped. Why else do we even have an assize of arms in 1181 in England? It's to set a minimum equipment range so that you have soldiers who are capable of fulfilling their role on the battlefield.
And this is one area where perceptions of the medieval period and people's roles often get in the way of the reality, because we've had members who were wearing the bare minimum equipment that they were legally required as the lowest status in England to own, get criticized because there's no way a peasant could afford those things. Well, by law, a peasant was supposed to have them. Now, if there's a law saying that you're supposed to have it, it's because a lot of people didn't have it and you need to enforce it. But the simple fact that this was an expected baseline, it speaks volumes. The idea of, here's a spear, no helmet, and just go off and face some mounted knight is more Hollywood than reality.
Yeah, maybe in the 9th century or the 10th century, that's the thing, but this is not the case in our time period. Something else that's important is that your levy troops are recruited by a member of your lord's household. Now, this probably doesn't happen in every situation, but this does tend to be a pattern. Somebody's not going out and grabbing some nameless serf and saying, all right, let's go. They're going to people who are able to afford, the gambeson, the spear, the helmet, what's required in the assize of arms. And these are professional folks. These are also folks that are known within the Lord's circle. They know who he is. He might recognize them from the market. These are people that, that are chosen with purpose. We don't have a lot of information about whether training was given or not. A whole lot of training isn't necessary to learn how to use a spear and to stand close together and don't move. But you did have musters all the time where people were gathered and they came together and they waited to move out. And if you don't take that opportunity to do some training, you're really missing out on an opportunity. I'm kind of the belief that training was given. I think it was minimal. I don't know that it was necessarily done all the time, but I think that some basic training was probably provided, especially because the knight is counting on them to do a specific job so that he can then do his job. I think there's enough. Contextual elements of what we see to say that it was at least plausible.
And we know Anglo-Saxon England had a very well-developed, we would call today a militia system. Yes. We know 200 years after Magna Carta that England, through the 100 Years War and longbowmen, has a very well and effectively created militia system to train longbowmen. The fact that there would be an empty gap in that middle where suddenly that militia system no longer exists is, I think, harder to justify. We have a lack of evidence, but that's not an evidence of lack.
Correct. Awesome. Thank you. Here's what your levy troops look like. Here's a closer look. This is your average peasant. He's got his gambeson, which is his thick padded coat on. You'll notice that coat is much thicker than what I'm wearing underneath my mail because this is his only body defense. He's got a helmet on and he's got a spear, which is required by the assize. A shield for this class is not necessarily required by the assize of arms 1181, but shields are cheap. And so he's gone ahead to pick one up because he would rather have it just in case. This is waiting at the muster. We're waiting on folks to gather, ready to move out. The levy men are with each other. They're probably not rubbing elbows with your knights or too many of your professional soldiers, but they definitely are spending time together. And you can kind of see their gear here up close. You see they're able to sit down, they're able to relax in this. Even though this is a thicker, textile garment, it does move with you. It allows you to move and to do what you need to do there.
And it is actually shockingly effective against a sword cut.
It is.
Not against a spear stab or a stabbing action, but against a slashing action, it is shockingly effective.
Yes, you can see, and that is something that textiles are good at. They absorb the blows. So, a thrust of some kind, like Andrew said, is going to be the weak point in some of this armor, but it is effective in other things. What does stuff cost? We don't have pure costs for many things in our period. We do have some here in the middle of the chart. You can see we know what things cost because they're recorded. They're recorded by John. They're recorded by in the pipe rolls. They're recorded by other nobles who are buying these things or were coming to their lord and saying, "Hey, I lost this on the battlefield. You need to replace this for me." And we know how much it cost. A destrier, which is a war horse, that cost is 40 pounds. That's more than your household knight makes in an entire year. That's the equivalent of a Ferrari, 200,000 US dollars. Now, again, that kind of power.
I have to point out here, just for sort of perspective, if you're thinking of medieval war horses, don't think of Clydesdales, Frisian, giant horses with hooves the size of dinner plates. Think more of a modern thoroughbred, probably, for the conformation of a medieval war horse.
So we know that in Flanders in 1284, the cost was 40 pounds. We have decent evidence to show that over the course of the 13th century, horse costs doubled. So this is kind of a speculative figure, but at 20 pounds, circa 1215, you're still looking at 200,000 USD. Again, I want to be really careful. It's hard to kind of figure out where this lies. The bigger point is this is a really expensive item. This is the most expensive item that you could buy. A courser, which is, Andrew, tell us about a courser and how it's different than a destrier.
So a destrier is a stallion. Destriers by the 1215 were starting to get more selective breeding. A courser is simply a strong, fast horse. So if you're thinking of sort of a modern thoroughbred gelding, probably is about right for a courser. Doesn't have the same muscle mass that a stallion would have, or probably the same level of training, which is also going to raise your cost.
Sure. So you can see here, much less expensive, but still a year's worth of wages almost for your average peasant. Some of your professional soldiers can afford this, especially if they can maintain horses over time. They can afford a couple of horses and they can have 2 or 3 ready to roll. Your draft horses are just kind of coming into being a thing now, and they're significantly cheaper.
And they're one of the reasons why agricultural products are just growing at an exponential rate, is because you moved from oxen to horse for plowing, which allows a much more efficient use of the land.
Excellent. I don't want to read through everything, but just kind of take a look. You can see it here at a hauberk, which is the kind of chainmail piece over here. Between 1201 and 1208 in England, the cost of an average one of those, and this is probably not a full-blown set, but something similar to what you would have seen me wearing in that previous picture, 3/4 length, not quite to the knee, to the middle of the thigh. £1, 6 shillings and 8 pence. That's very affordable for a professional soldier. If you have a peasant that makes a good income, is on the higher end of that scale, they can afford it, or they can save over a couple of years and afford it. Down here toward the bottom, your spear, 1 shilling. That's 3 days' wage for your average peasant. So they don't necessarily have that money to just kind of throw around all the time. But what they're required to have, their weapon is only 3 days' wage, and that's something that they can reasonably come up with over time. So I think that's something that's kind of important to notice. And here again, you kind of see a relative scale and picture of different outfits for different status on the field. Andrew and I said that we wish that we had lined up from least equipped to most equipped to kind of give a picture of that, but we sadly didn't think of that. I'm probably going to just skip past this one because we're so far over on time. Maybe this is something we could talk about at another time if we have time or interest. But here you can see some pictures of various types of equipment in use. Axes are a big deal. Spears, crossbows, swords are sidearms. They're rarely somebody's principal weapon. Crossbows, longbows, and even slings are still a big deal. They're used and talked about in art and in references of the time. Here you can see an example from the Messianic Bible, different weapons being used. And then even here, this is a battle. This is Matthew Paris's account of the siege of Damietta. And you can even see here some staff slings being used, which is a sling on the end of a pole, which throws a heavier object farther and does more damage.
Jonathan,
Yes.
there's an elephant.
There is.
There was a tradition in medieval art at this time to put sort of a siege-like scene on the back of an elephant. Elephants were known. They knew what they looked like. Not everybody.
Well, kind of.
Some of your people would have known, especially those who who might have done some traveling post-Crusade, might have come across some of this, or at least descriptions of this. But elephants, by and large, were not really known well in England or ever used in England.
Is this a connection to Alexander with the elephant?
Possibly. Yes.
So a lot of one of the hard parts whenever you're working with medieval illustrations is you not only have to look for the visual subject depicted, but what is the story that they're telling. So if there's often elements from, say, David and Goliath is a very frequently depicted image, and it's useful for us as historians because Goliath, as a professional soldier, is drawn to have professional soldiers' equipment. Well, Goliath also usually is wearing metal armor on his legs because he's biblically described as having metal armor on his legs. So that's where you have to understand not only the pictorial context of the image, but also the story that they're trying to tell.
Depicted. Yeah, it could be a slippery slope for sure. We kind of have the idea of basic levy training. Here's some experimental combat that we conducted at our last event. Knights are usually on horse, but they're not always. There are plenty of accounts of knights dismounting, especially probably lower end knights or barons were asked to dismount and strengthen the infantry line. So we experimented with that. What does it look like? What would it be? Here you can see spearmen. Of course, we're using blunt weapons, dowel rods for safety, but the armor is real. The shields are real. You can see some action happening here. You have spearmen. There in the foreground, you see a dowel rod being used like an axe, so a different weapon type. And we found that it was very hard to predict outcomes. There are different ways that things play out. Partnering with other folks. Having a partner in line next to you and working together against an opponent can change the outcome of the battle. And then here you kind of see what a muster camp setup might look like. And you see some basic training happening while we're waiting for the rest of the company to muster and move out. So what about women? This is something that often is overlooked. There's not as much written about them, but women were very important. And something that's important to recognize is that your lady of the manor was the second most important person in the manor, period. And oftentimes, in some function, in some capacity, she was more important than the lord of the manor. Andrew, would you disagree with that statement before I?
No, not at all. So a lot of our views of medieval life are colored by the Victorian era, especially in relationships between men and women. And the Victorians kind of applied their unique idea of how men and women should interact on previous time periods. I think in general, medieval women had far more power in their relationships with men and in their responsibilities, both, rights and responsibilities as home. That doesn't mean that they didn't have, that everything was equal. And I'm not trying to paint too rosy a picture, but even the concept of something like a dowry. Well, the point of a dowry is not that the husband gets land for marrying this woman. It's that the value of that dowry is guaranteed to the woman, no matter how marital status might change.
Correct.
So if some reason that marriage ends or her husband dies and the manor is left to a male son, then that woman is still guaranteed the value of that dowry as an assurity that she can live off for the rest of her life.
That is her insurance policy, and it can be used to advantage, by her husband. especially if they are aligned in their decision making and in what their goals are. But they did have rights, and they had avenues and elements of their existence that you really wouldn't see until later in sometimes, some ways, even in the 20th century. So that is something that's interesting to see and look at. Your lady of the manor oftentimes is a major house administrator. She helps oversee staff. She absolutely is the planner of important socio-political functions for her husband. She is the chief entertainer when the king comes or when other nobles come to visit, when the court is hosting someone or something. It doesn't always turn out this way, obviously, but in the good situations, in the ways where things work the way it was supposed to, this is a team effort. And she is a very important part of political success for her husband. She supports his diplomatic endeavors on trips through hospitality in the home. There are several accounts of women going with their husbands, especially on crusade, where they would go. Other times they don't go. Peasant women, in some ways, bear even more power in their day-to-day existence than noble women did. And I want to be careful how I say that, because that is a general statement. That's generally speaking. It's not always true. But in the day-to-day existence, it's pretty interesting. They still, at this time, are bearing the brunt of domestic duties, children, food prep, tending family livestock, etc. That stuff is still definitely a part of that, that female identity in marriage at this time.
To be very clear, roles and responsibilities are extremely gendered in the medieval world.
Absolutely.
So there's no such thing as an equal opportunity of tasks.
No,
that's not necessarily the same thing as an equal opportunity of responsibility or rights. But things are extremely gendered.
Correct. One of the ways where you get the most, I don't really want to even use the term equality, but where you, for lack of a better term, where you get the most equality is actually in business, is in the trade or the family, the family network of things. There are several accounts in this time period of women whose husbands die, and they take over the family business and they run the business. It becomes they are now the chandler, the candle maker. They are, most women are not going into, become stone cutters or miners.
No, but there is imagery of blacksmiths.
But there are imagery of blacksmiths, and there, especially in your towns, is probably where this becomes more prominent. Where you have baker, the two biggest, jobs where women were sole proprietors in business were bakers and brewers. Those kind of go hand in hand, and then also in textile manufacturing. So it could be tailors, it could be the cloth makers themselves, sometimes called fullers. So you end up with women in business, and in many ways they did share more equality with their husbands than noble women did. But I do want to use that word very carefully. Equality is not in the sense that we understand it, but equality in the sense that they had rights and a say in their own life with their husband to some degree, not necessarily task-based, but legally based.
Jake, did you have a point?
Just to add on to that too, with like marriage, especially, marriages were oftentimes arranged, even in the peasant classes. But you were more likely, like you say, to have to say about your partner or your future partner than the nobility were. If you were a noble woman, you were essentially a way to kind of broker deals or gain some ground with a potential ally or whatever it was. You were much more of a commodity than you were a peasant woman, and like it says here, had a lot more say. So yeah, but in marriage too, that was also a big thing.
Perfect.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. It was also very much an understood aspect of life. That doesn't make it better or worse.
Right.
But there's been some interesting arguments made in terms of modern relationships of how little choice even modern people have in the individuals they meet and build relationships with, which kind of struck me thinking about a medieval world too. So there's a lot of interesting factors that go into all of these various pieces.
Sure. If you're looking for a good resource on women in the 13th century, there's a new book published this year called Ladies of Magna Carta, which I have not read in its entirety. Let me just say I haven't read it in its entirety, but what I have read is very good and would be well worth checking out. So what are our conclusions? What do we come to here when we're talking about this period? John, I'm sorry, you may not be happy with this assessment, but John was mostly reviled by chroniclers in his time. I'm not necessarily of the ability to judge John, but Gerald of Wales, who was his instructor growing up, he was the one who taught John many things in life. He wrote the work on the instruction of a prince around 1190. So John is close to 30 at this point, and his view of John is negative. There's a Margam Abbey Chronicle written in 1205. So before John's reign has really taken off too much. He's only been on the throne for 6 years, and he's viewed as negative. The Barnwell Abbey Chronicle sees him as mostly negative. And then Matthew Paris, his Greater Chronicle, he started writing that in the 1230s, or at least parts of it. It was fully compiled in around 1260, and he does not like John at all. So that's kind of how he's viewed by some of the chroniclers at his time. Andrew, do you want to kind of take some of this as well about?
Yeah, I mean, even so, if you look, we can understand why ecclesiastical sources might not like John after fleecing them for all they were worth, and issues with the church. But even secular sources, I mean, the biographer of William Marshall is not a fan of John, despite the fact that Marshall essentially stayed loyal to John. Yeah. Although there is some places where Marshall and John probably had more dealings that are kind of distanced in the biography, which probably reflects the nature of the world in which it was written. It's like, well, we don't want to see like we were too loyal to John 30 years after his death. But even that says something about the world that he left. There are very few period accounts of John that are overwhelmingly positive. Right. The good ones are mostly, he had some good points, he had some bad points.
Agreed. I think there's a clear line that can be drawn between John's action and a rise in the power held by his barons. We see this in a lot of monarchs, so it's not necessarily unusual that barons rebel. But I think what is interesting here is that you can see point by point connections. You see how this grows over a period of really about 10 to 15 years. You kind of see how that grows over time. His behavior, at least in the Chronicles, is marked by general anxiety. And he is somebody that's paranoid about his barons. He will not trust them. And that might be rightfully so on his part. But also, they did not trust him.
That becomes so self-fulfilling, though.
Right. It became, that's the point, is it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. And many felt urged to action because of John's behavior. And the chroniclers literally in Latin use the words evil or incompetence. And again, we can't put all our eggs in that same basket. But what they saw as incompetence was increasing taxation while losing valuable land. They generally saw his reliance on mercenaries and refusal to involve any of his barons in the running of the country as an inability to govern. They didn't see that as a choice. They saw it as incompetence, as an inability to govern. And
it's somewhat profound too that the baron's first choice was not bring in a foreign king to overthrow John. The baron's first choice was, let's create some sort of document so that we know where the boundaries are in this life we're leading with Magna Carta.
Let's just try to keep John in bounds.
And that's been pointed out by some historians as that is a unique element of this struggle, is that the first recourse was to try to create a system to provide, not to go for somebody else to rule, because there were lots of other people that had claim. I mean, even Louis is not just a random pick as a new king of England. He's got some, I think he's essentially a nephew of Henry II. But to come up with some sort of system in writing for how we can better organize this.
I don't think, too, I think maybe one of the key points is we can't say that Magna Carta might not have come about if it hadn't been for John, because there was some movement headed that way. But I think we can probably say with pretty serious certainty that Magna Carta definitely wouldn't have happened the way it did without John and his personality, without him being John. So maybe those are some key takeaways about this from John.
And we can argue that, it was all about economic reasons, but you can make that argument for a whole lot of world-changing revolutions that we usually view quite positively. So I know there have been a lot of historians that have pointed out, well, American Revolution, no taxation without representation, which kind of comes from Magna Carta anyway. But there's definitely an economic tipping point to issues that may be deeper than that. Whether it's for good or for ill, that's a whole other conversation. But often the economics are what finally tips it over the edge.
One of the things too that I hope that we've kind of dispelled in this discussion is that every person, regardless of your status in medieval society, had basic rights and dignity, and that was something that was important to recognize. The higher up you go in the station, the more rights and dignity you get. So it's definitely fluid, for sure. But even the lowest of the low had some sort of legal recourse that they were able to leverage. I don't know that it ever really served them in the way that it was supposedly intended to do as written out, but it does exist in fact, and I don't think we can ignore that. I want us to recognize the difference between peasants and serfs, and that your average peasant had more than just a constantly meager existence. You have some regular Joes who make it into the record. For example, what's his name? Lionheart de Cordan is a peasant whose artwork survives. And how did he get the materials with which to do art that was expensive? How did he learn to draw in this way? He was somebody that was interested in it, and he did it. And that's not true of everybody, but your average medieval peasant could have a meaningful life, and I think that's important to remember. Serfs could move out of serfdom in England with their lord's permission. I don't think this happens.
Or run away to that town.
Or run away to town, exactly. I don't think this happened very often as far as lords giving permission for that, because they did need them to work the land. But it was written into law and codified, maybe starting in the reign of Edward the Confessor. Maybe not. Maybe after that. Andrew, do you know? I don't know for sure.
All I know is that by Henry II, that is well part of the legal.
Yeah.
That's where really my legal studies pick up with Henry II.
It exists. If you were lowborn and you wanted to try to move yourself ahead in life at all, the easiest way to do that was to become a professional soldier. There's a great risk that comes with that, but at the same time, if you could be successful at that, that was an assured way to earn significantly higher wages and to find yourself in a position where where you could move beyond the serf existence or the existence of peasants. War was a common feature of the period, or warlike activity. There were clashes, smaller clashes here and there fairly often. Open war was not always happening. But you had a militaristic class that trained everything they had was built around being able to train for this, because it was a common enough occurrence where that was necessary and it was needed. Diplomacy is still absolutely preferred to open war, and did help to avert many crises, but war is part of the picture.
1215 is about the first time in a generation that you see massive warfare in the interior of England. There's constant warfare going on, but it's all been on the periphery, whether it's been with the Scots or the Welsh or in France, always in France.
Yes, or even some nobles with other nobles.
Yeah, wow.
That goes without saying, I guess.
Border, yes.
So kind of moving on from there, one of the things too that the extensions by this is that if you are going to govern effectively, you have to have military capacity, both in availability of arms and men, and also in competent leadership. You didn't necessarily have to possess it yourself, but you had to have someone that was loyal to you that you could rely on to do this for you. And also, we didn't get to talk a lot about troops, but varied troop formations that support each other were necessary for success on the battlefield. And if you could have success on the battlefield, you could have success in other areas. It made the rest of medieval life make sense. So,
I mean, it's not an accident that we kind of get the modern rules for chess during this time period and the interplay of various pieces and how they work with each other.
Exactly. So that is what we have. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Andrew. I appreciate this was amazing. This was beyond anything we ever experienced. even top Teutonic Knights, my friend.
I hope it was not too dry or uninteresting.
No. I mean, I will put this on the YouTube channel with your permission. And
sure.
Like I said, I have a website now I created this morning using Wix. So you can, it actually called, not the Magna Carta, but what did I call it? I had it up. It's actually called Omni Carta because I couldn't find Magna Carta was not available. .org. So all the YouTube channel information will be there. I really appreciate it. I hope you guys come back. We love this. Teutonic Knights was a excellent. This is top the bar. Raise the bar higher. And I hope you guys come back. Medieval time it's like dark ages that nobody knows about really that well like you guys do. It's very detailed, incredible detail.
Well, and I think what has shocked all of us as we've gotten heavy into this research is how much light there is in the dark ages.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying.
Yep.
It's so much light, but like I said, if you want to guys come back and do maybe something on Saxony or something in Germany or Barbarossa is always a famous one.
There's Barbarossa.
Crusade.
Or we can continue on England. We did actually a little bit of England, but 1640 revolution or civil war, whatever you call it, but we didn't go that low. So now we're at world 1200s, but like I said, even either conquest of by Vikings. We have actually a Viking expert, Joshua. He wrote a book.
Oh, nice.
On Viking languages, and he comes back every once in a while, and he does mostly. He did Althingi, which is the Iceland population of by Vikings, and we did 2 of those. We did the Harold the Vinehair first, and then we did the Althingi. So that was really amazing. And I think this works really well with it. If we could kind of go through those Viking series a little bit. I don't know. You guys watched it?
I really enjoyed it. I was on no video, but I was listening, and it was very nice. So thank you so much for letting me listen in.
Absolutely. Thank you.
That we come back.
Very informative.
Thank you so much.
You guys blow us out of the park. Yeah. Thank you so much.
I know we went over, but thank you so much for the opportunity and the time. This has been very enjoyable on our part as well.
Yeah, and I guess we will be in contact if you want to do any further subjects.
Sure.
Sounds good.
All right, thank you so much. I appreciate it, and have a nice evening, everybody.
Have a good night, all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Good night.